Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We will now begin. Story 1. The Knight and the Camel Train, Crossing the Empty Quarter. You are not standing on grass. You are not marching through fog or mud. You are instead sweating beneath layers of linen, chainmail, and hardened leather as the sun slowly roasts your helmet like a pot on a fire. The year is 1267, and you, a knight of middling rank and uncertain fame, are attempting to cross part of the world that most in your homeland think doesn't exist, the Rub al-Khali, or the Empty Quarter. It is not quite the Sahara, though it might as well be. You have, through an unusual mix of debt, exile, and misguided faith, ended up here, in Arabia. And you are now part of a camel caravan loaded not with gold but with salt blocks, dried fish, and fragile pottery, bound from the Arabian coast toward the interior. A journey of weeks, maybe months if you survive. Let us start not with action but with planning, because planning is how knights survived deserts. Not valor, not speed, just planning. The packing of a knight in the desert. You brought too much, you always do. Europe trained you for rain, not sand. Your sword rusted on the first week. You packed vinegar to clean wounds but forgot to bring enough dates, a staple that desert travelers prize above all else. They are light, dense, high in sugar. You have 9 pounds. A local guide whom your order paid in advance carries 30. Water is the obsession. Every bladder, every goatskin, every hollowed-out gourd in the caravan is a piece of gold. Your armor has been stripped down. No greaves, no pauldrons. Just chainmail over linen with a padded coif. Still, it boils you slowly like stew. You learn that most knights died in deserts not from thirst, but from dehydration due to salt imbalance. Sweating removes salt. Drinking only water makes it worse. A knight's worst enemy is not thirst, but hyponatremia, though no one calls it that yet. The local healers call it soft blood or wandering head. So you eat salted fish, sometimes sand-covered, as the camels grunt. The fish keeps you alive. The maps you don't trust. Your scrolls are useless. European maps show the Sahara and Empty Quarter as vague blotches, sometimes illustrated with dragons or tents. Here be lions. More than one map labels the vast terrain simply as unknown. But the caravan masters know every dune. They don't use maps. They use stars, scars in rock formations, patterns in camel bones left at crossroads, and oral stories passed from grandfather to grandson. These stories include details so tedious and exacting that you find them sleep-inducing. Turn left at the 3rd acacia tree, if it still lives. If the sand glitters like bone, you've gone too far east. Follow the wind, but only after it changes once. You write none of this down, instead you listen. Because getting lost here is worse than dying in battle. It is slow, it is dull, it is silent. The caravan's logic. There are 20 camels, each is named, not poetically but practically. Shaker, Quick Step, Spits at Night. Each camel has quirks. They carry trade goods, water, and occasionally the weak. You were proud once. You now ride Shaker when heatstroke begins to set in. The caravan is led by a man called Al-Mutawakkil, which means the one who trusts in God. You think his real name is something else, but the title suits him. He trusts the desert to be cruel. He respects it like a vengeful king. His rules are absolute. Walk at dawn and dusk. Rest in midday. Sleep in tight circles. Speak only when necessary. Drink only when told. He carries a spear, not to fight with but to measure sand depth, and to poke for scorpions under rock shade. You learn from him, but slowly. The night watch. Nights are worse than days. Cold that sinks into the bones. A wind that whispers nonsense. Once, you wake to what sounds like chanting, but it is just sand grains blowing through the ear holes of your helmet. You volunteer for night watch, The stars are oddly helpful. Orion hangs sideways here. The desert sky is clear enough to see meteors. Your horse is gone traded for water and camel supplies in the first week. The order would disapprove. You no longer care. Sometimes you think about home, about oak trees, about wine. But mostly you try to remember the sequence of wells, which one is next and how long you must ration your water. You record it in the margins of a psalter. The boring bits that matter. The caravan moves 6 miles per day, slowly. It feels slower than that. The key is endurance, not speed. At each stop, tents are pitched in the same pattern. Fires are lit low with dung as fuel. You learn that desert travel is not heroic. It is maintenance. Maintaining leather straps with oil and prayer. Keeping flies off salted meat. Checking for camel sores. Watching for signs of betrayal from within. You are told to sleep with your dagger under your tongue, not for drama, for survival. An unusual companion. Among the caravan is a monk not of your order but a Coptic Christian from Egypt. He has a hooked nose and speaks 6 languages. He says he is seeking a library buried in sand, lost before the time of Christ. You suspect this is madness, but he carries scrolls and you admire that. He shares one strange fact, that the bones of old camels were once used as signposts, bleached by sun and shaped into arrows by bored travelers. He shows you one, you don't believe it at first, but then you realize he's right. That curved femur, it's pointing, always pointing. A day with no end. By day 21, your lips are cracked, your prayers are hoarse. You have not written in your journal for 3 days. The sand has claimed 2 of the caravan's helpers, not with violence but with silence. They simply sat down, closed their eyes, and exhaled. You walk past them. This is not cruelty. This is how survival works here. Morning wastes time, time wastes water. You begin to see the logic. A discovery. On day 27, you find a well-worn knot on the expected path. It is old, covered with a stone slab, but the monk insists this is one of the whispering wells mentioned in his scrolls. You open it. There is water, not much, but enough, and on the stone is carved something curious. To drink is to forget. You drink anyway. And you begin to wonder, how many other wells are hidden here waiting, and who placed them? The water from the whispering well was muddy, but you drank it anyway. There were no other choices. And now, the landscape stretches on in every direction, identical and endless, a world of bleached dunes and horizons that never change. The desert is not dramatic like your old training stories made it sound. It is not full of ambushes and storms every day. It is worse than that. It is slow, monotonous, oppressive in its silence, and it is here within this unbearable repetition that men break. But you have not broken yet. The rules of endurance. Al-Mutawakkil now speaks to you more often. You walk better, he says once. You don't know whether it's a compliment or an observation. You've stopped limping, perhaps, or maybe you just move like someone who no longer expects things to improve. You're learning what matters: shade, salt, silence, and sleep. You've also learned to treat the desert like a bureaucracy, not a battlefield. Progress is not won with willpower, but by obeying rules, tedious, unspoken ones. Don't speak during walking hours. Sand eats voices. Don't step on dunes when you can walk around them. Don't waste energy waving flies away. Don't look for meaning in the wind's sound. It is never speaking to you. These rules are not glorious, but they are how you stay alive. The value of tedium. You begin to understand something peculiar. Those who survive the desert are not the boldest or the strongest. They are the ones who find routine comforting. One man in the caravan, an older Berber guide, recites the same prayer every day, at exactly the same time with the same cadence. He counts his steps aloud in 3s. He sings to his camel. He never complains, and you notice something else. He has the freshest eyes and the least cracked skin. Repetition, it seems, conserves energy. You begin reciting your psalter not for salvation but for rhythm. You time your breaths to the verses. You whisper the lines to your knees. You write nothing new but reread old notes. You become a creature of habit, like the desert itself. The abandoned way station. On day 31, the caravan reaches something unexpected, an abandoned way station, buried halfway in sand. It is a low, flat-roofed structure made of packed mud and stone, mostly collapsed. Only the water trough and partial roof remain. Al-Mutawakkil says this was once a night hospitaller outpost, though no one is sure. Your pulse quickens. There is a carved stone in Latin, ad vigilias noctis servamus. In the night watches we keep guard. No other trace of nights remains, but in the corner of the ruins you find a small rusted buckle marked faintly with a cross. Perhaps it is a trick of weathering, perhaps not. What happened to them? Did they turn back? Did they build this place and die here? The monk notes the sand line. It has risen over a meter in what he estimates is 50 years. The desert swallows history slowly, but with absolute certainty. What the monk believes. The Coptic monk speaks more now. His name, you learn, is Brother Macarios. He was once a librarian in Alexandria. He believes the desert holds secrets of spiritual purity. That suffering in this landscape mirrors the journey of the Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits who wandered into sand seeking divine silence. He tells you, God may not speak in cathedrals, but he might whisper in the dunes. You wonder if heat has addled his mind. But he also tells you something else, that Romans once crossed this way too, sending scouts and messengers between Egypt and the Arabian coast. Not in large numbers, but often enough that some of their records survived, buried in papyrus jars deep in desert caves. He says there is a cave system ahead, maybe 2 days, maybe 5. You tell him you doubt caves exist in this terrain. He only smiles. Encounters in the sand. That night you are bitten by a sand adder. It is not dramatic. You reach under your blanket and feel a sharp jab like a needle. The guide reacts swiftly. He slices your ankle, squeezes it, spits on it, and packs the wound with dried herbs soaked in camel milk. You do not know whether the ritual is effective, but you survive. You sleep feverishly. You wake sweating. The monk sits nearby, fanning your face with a piece of parchment. Desert things strike without noise, he says, like most truths. You begin to dislike how often he speaks in riddles, and yet you remember what he says. Knights don't belong here. You are no longer sure what you are. Knight, mercenary, relic. Your sword is pitted with rust. You haven't practiced martial drills in weeks. Your shield was left behind, traded for rope and dried figs. You have not had a true confession in 2 months. What is a knight who does not fight, who does not serve, who has no lord but the desert? Yet you still wear your surcoat. It is patched with camel hide now, but the cross remains. You remember an old teaching, to serve is to suffer with dignity. You think the desert is helping you understand what that actually means. The crisis of the camel. On day 38, Shaker goes lame. Your favorite camel, the one you bonded with, the one who once bit your hand but later learned to accept your singing, falls to its knees and won't rise. Al-Mutawakkil inspects the beast. He will not recover. You plead, he shrugs. You realize that camels, for all their utility, are just tools in the caravan's logic, not friends, not fellow travelers. The caravan cannot carry sentiment. You are given a new camel. You do not name it. You dream of Shaker that night. In the dream he speaks, he says, "Stop remembering. The desert remembers nothing." You wake feeling ashamed of your dreams. The mirage. On day 41, you see a tower. It rises on the horizon, distant, shimmering. You point it out. Others nod, but no one changes course. You ask if it's real. Al-Mutawakkil replies, "If we reach it, it was real. If we don't, it was not." You walk toward it for half a day. The sun rises, then drops. The tower disappears. You speak of it again. No one answers. That night the monk says, "Not all lies are malicious. Some are hopes wearing costumes." The loop. You feel as though the world is repeating itself. Same sand, same wind, same rock formation. You write in your journal, "I think I saw this dune 3 days ago, or perhaps I only dreamed I did." But then something changes. You see a skull clearly human, partially buried, not fresh, old, wind-smoothed, but unmistakably real, and next to it a small coin. It is not Arabic, not Byzantine, but Frankish. You pick it up. It bears a cross, your cross. How did it get here? Were you not the first knight to try this path? Closing scene. That night the wind howls louder than usual. The monk speaks only once. He says, "There are bones under every dune, but not all left behind coins." You want to ask what that means, but you're too tired. Your hands ache, your lips sting, and the stars above you flicker, motionless and cold. Tomorrow, the guide says, you will reach something new. An old settlement, a place built in stone. You dare to wonder, could it be civilization? The morning begins without fanfare. The sun climbs with its usual indifference. The camels groan. Your back cracks like dry kindling. But today feels different, not because of what you feel, but because of what the others do not. There is an edge of anticipation among the caravan, carefully masked in silence. The desert's routines are not broken often, so when they are, even by a single word settlement, you take notice. You've survived this far, but you still don't know why you came. Was it exile? Was it redemption? Was it curiosity? Or was it just the slow drift of bad decisions, finally deposited in the middle of the world's largest sandbox? Now, after 40+ days of sand, silence, and survival, you may finally approach something built by human hands. The first stones. You see them hours before arrival. At first they appear as natural outcroppings, but soon the lines become too straight, the angles too intentional. Walls, foundations, ruins. Not tents, not camps, buildings. The caravan slows. Al-Mutawakkil raises a single hand. It is a command, not a gesture. The column halts, camels rest, riders dismount, you wait. He surveys the site through a piece of curved, polished glass, an object more valuable than any blade you now carry. It magnifies. You glimpse a shimmer of mosaic, perhaps tiled flooring, half buried. He turns to you, "You may go." You are startled, alone. He nods, "You are looking for something, we are only passing through." The monk joins you, uninvited. "If there is a library, I'll know it." The architecture of a forgotten town. It isn't a city, not even a village, more likely a trade post long abandoned, a midway stop between greater destinations. The layout is organized in a grid of 9 stone structures, arranged like teeth. Each one is roofless, the beams long since eaten by sun and wind. But inside, you see things that make your chest tighten. A rusted helm in the corner of one room, of Western make. Wall carvings of Latin script, simple phrases, ad pacem, ad portum. A collapsed altar, where you see a faded Christian cross carved into the base. And nearby, a ring not gold, iron, but engraved. You pick it up. It is marked with the insignia of the Order of Santiago, a knightly order not typically associated with this Far East. The monk studies the altar. They made it here, but not for long. The remnants of knowledge. The monk leads you to what he claims is a scribe's chamber. It is not hard to believe. The walls are lined with shallow niches. In one corner, a scroll case cracked and empty. But one piece remains. A fragment of parchment, fragile as lace, faded, but the ink clings. It is written in Latin, and you recognize the script as a mixture of ecclesiastical notes and inventory. 4 camels died before the third moon, 2 men taken by fever. Father Lucian says we must press on. The water is low, but the stars guide us. No names of knights, no battles, just a small note of exhaustion recorded in ink that outlasted the hand that wrote it. You hand it to the monk. He rolls it carefully and places it in a tube carved from antler. A room of salt. One of the rooms contains only salt. Not a little, not a sack. A floor covered in it hardened into crust. The walls are encrusted with streaks of white. You don't understand. The monk explains. A storage vault, perhaps broken. The salt leached into the floor. The rest was stolen or dissolved. You kneel and scrape some into a pouch. Salt is worth more than silver in this desert. You think again about the European knights who must have rested here. You wonder, did they die just after leaving? Did they make it through? No graves are visible. But you see burn marks on one wall, soot blackened, signs of conflict, or just cooking. There is no way to know. The silence holds its answers tightly. The echoes of trade. In another structure, you find broken amphorae. Some carry markings from the Nile region. Others appear Roman in style, though that may be an imitation. One ceramic fragment contains traces of indigo dye. Another holds resin from myrrh trees, evidence of trade. A third still smells faintly sweet, dates, dried and preserved. The monk observes they brought goods from both worlds, north and south, perhaps east and west too. Maybe your knights were never lost. Maybe they were just redirected. You consider this. What if this was not failure? What if a handful of knights stayed here, not by force but by choice? What if they adapted? You scan the stones again, searching for anything resembling a burial site or a final note. Nothing. Just wind, always the wind. The weapons left behind. You find a sword blade, shattered in half. You find arrowheads, triangular and barbed, clearly local. And you find a shield, though only the iron boss remains. The wood rotted away. In one corner, a strange sight. A grinding stone used to sharpen tools, still showing grooves from use. Someone was preparing to fight, or to defend, but against whom? No other signs of violence are present. No bones, no blood stains. Perhaps the attackers took their dead, or perhaps it was never a battle. You realize that in desert history, absence is the most common evidence. The night in the ruins. Al-Mutawakkil allows the caravan to sleep near the ruins just for one night. It is a risky choice, but perhaps he knows you need this. The monk sits beside a crumbling pillar, reading silently from a copied psalter. You sit alone, looking up. You think of the knight who wrote the journal fragment. Was he watching the same stars? Did he also wonder if crossing this desert meant erasing everything behind him? You have no answers, but you feel calm. Not triumphant, not satisfied. Just and quiet. The caravan moves on. In the morning, the caravan departs. No grand declarations, no ceremonies, just the slow resumption of the march. The same camels, the same routines, the same measured silences. You ride on a new camel, still unnamed. The monk walks beside you. Neither of you speaks for 3 days. You leave the ruins behind. No markers, no trail. Within weeks, wind will bury them again. Final reflections, memory in the sand. You reach the edge of the empty quarter weeks later. There is no finish line, just a gradual return to scrubland, then brush, then towns. Markets with color, streets with noise, shade that feels unnatural. When you speak of the journey, few believe you. Those who do not care. It is too far away, too long ago, too dull. But you know what you saw, you know what it meant. Not in glory, not in conquest, but in resilience. Your armor remains rusted, your sword dulled, but but your eyes are sharp. You carry in your pouch a ring, a coin, and a small lump of hardened salt. No one asks what they are. And yet without them, you might forget that you were once a knight who crossed the empty quarter. Not to win, not to conquer, but simply to endure. Closing thought. How many others made the crossing, left no stories behind, and were swallowed whole by the sand, yet still shaped the quiet survival of trade, culture, and faith. Story 2. The Tuareg trade routes and European ambitions. You may think of salt as seasoning, a sprinkle, a crystal. But for much of history, salt was wealth. Salt was survival. Salt could command armies, buy kingdoms, and drive men across deserts. And in the deep interior of Africa, stretching across the edge of the Sahara, salt took on its purest and harshest form, a trade that cut across dunes, death, and diplomacy. And at the center of this were the Tuareg, the blue-robed, veiled desert riders, master traders, merciless raiders, reluctant hosts. And one day in the mid-14th century, these Tuareg met Europeans not with swords at first, but with steel. And what followed was not a war or a crusade, but something slower, duller, yet far more enduring. It was trade, specifically salt for steel. Salt slabs and caravans, the backbone of the Sahara. Let us begin not with swords, but with blocks. Salt blocks, each one roughly 90 pounds, quarried in slabs from places like Taoudeni, Tagheza, or Bilma, cut by hand, dragged from mines that looked like open wounds in the desert floor. These blocks were not for flavor. They were for preserving meat, feeding animals, and stabilizing economies. Whole caravans, sometimes numbering 10,000 camels, would carry only salt. Their journey could last months, covering thousands of kilometers across a featureless wasteland. The Tuareg knew every watering hole, every wind pattern, every rock that marked a turn. They used oral maps, not inked ones. And with them they carried steel weapons, many of which came not from North Africa, but from the edges of Europe. Where did this steel come from? That's where the story turns. The reach of European steel. In the early 1300s, as European kingdoms expanded trade with Moroccan and Iberian ports, a quiet but persistent commerce developed. European blacksmiths, particularly from Toledo and Genoa, began exporting unfinished steel blades, which were then mounted, decorated, and sold across North Africa. These blades were longer than traditional desert weapons, heavier, meant for slashing, not stabbing, ill-suited for horseback warfare at first, but deadly in ambushes and in static defense. Tuareg warriors did not adopt them wholesale. They were selective. Steel was rare, expensive, and difficult to maintain in arid climates. But for tribal leaders, chiefs, and mercenaries, owning a foreign blade was a symbol of authority. And so salt flowed north. Steel flowed south. A boring ledger, a vital record. In a dusty market in Sijilmassa, a trade town on the edge of the desert, a merchant's ledger survives barely. Fragile parchment, faded ink. It lists items exchanged during a caravan stop in 1348. 3 slabs of salt for 1 dagger. 6 slabs for a steel-headed spear. 14 slabs for a longsword, from a Christian forge, slightly worn. 2 slabs for nails and strips, likely used for armor repairs. It is not poetic, it is not heroic, it is bookkeeping. But it tells you the truth. Salt and steel were equals in this world. And no knight, no Tuareg warrior, no merchant survived without both. Why the Tuareg needed steel? The Tuareg already had weapons, short swords, spears, and slings. They were mobile, fast, and deadly in their environment. But steel from Europe held a different edge. It lasted longer, it cut deeper, and perhaps most importantly, it signaled alliances. Owning a European weapon showed you had connections, that you could barter with Berber middlemen, speak enough Arabic to negotiate, and that your tribe had influence. the steel also helped in an unexpected way: camel bandits. Entire subcultures in the desert made a living raiding caravans. A leader with a European blade, often heavier and more intimidating, had an advantage in these quick, brutal fights. Still, steel was rare, so how did it get this far? From port to desert. It began at Ceuta, Tunis, or Melilla coastal ports, where European ships unloaded crates of metal goods in exchange for spices, slaves, and salt. From there, the steel traveled by donkey or cart inland, passed between traders like a whispered message. Some went to Marrakesh, others to Fez, and still others east toward Gao or Timbuktu, burgeoning centers of wealth and learning. At each stop, items were broken down. A sword might be disassembled into blade, guard, and hilt, sold separately to increase profit. In one 1350s account, a Berber merchant proudly records that he sold a single blade to 3 buyers, each receiving a part they could remake into something new. This recycling of steel, slow, unglamorous, tedious, helped build the arsenal of the desert. The trading ritual. Trade in the Sahara was not fast, it was not loud, it was not casual. When a Tuareg caravan arrived at a trade outpost, the ritual began. The camels were led in silently. Goods were not discussed openly. Instead, samples were laid out: salt here, steel there. A period of watching followed. Traders observed each other's choices, postures, tone. Only then the real negotiation began. It could take hours, sometimes days. Deals were often sealed with a gesture, a single nod, a tap on the salt, or a shared sip of water, a greater sign of trust than any signature. One European trader from Genoa, writing in 1371, complained in his journal, "They spoke not one word to me, only to my servant. I was a ghost among them, but they took my blades, paid well, never once smiled." Trade did not require friendship, just precision. An Islamic scholar's account. The famous North African traveler Ibn Battuta passed through these regions in the mid-14th century. In his writings, he barely mentions European knights, but he records in detail the flow of salt and the presence of foreign metal. In Tagheza, he describes a town made entirely of salt blocks, with houses constructed from slabs and held together by mud. The air stank of decay, yet the town was immensely profitable. He noted, "Slaves carry the salt on their backs, camels carry the steel, and among them all the merchants carry no weapons but are more dangerous than the sword." It was a quiet observation, easily skipped over, but it captures something important. The economy of this world was slow but sharp. A strange visitor, the European night trader. In 1352, a record surfaces in a monastery on the border of Aragon. A letter, short, faded. The signature is missing, but it describes a man, a knight without land, who traveled with Berbers into the southern desert. He was not a missionary, not a soldier. He was a trader. The letter reads, "He carried blades of our make, but wore robes of theirs. His face veiled, not in shame, but for the dust. He spoke their tongue well. He said salt would make him richer than blood ever had." We do not know who he was, but in Tuareg oral tradition there is mention of a pale-faced merchant known as Al-Faraz al-Abiad, the White Horseman. He sold weapons, taught them how to clean steel in desert conditions, and then vanished. Did he die? Did he return home? Did he become Tuareg? The story ends there. Closing scene. The sun sets over Azalai, the great salt caravan, 10,000 camels. Dust hangs in the air like smoke. Each beast carries 2 salt blocks. Among them, wrapped in blankets and secured by rope, are bundles of steel daggers, tips, bars, unmarked, unnamed. In the distance, a Tuareg rider adjusts his veil and looks west. He does not know what Europe is, but he knows the value of what it makes. He rides on, the rhythm of the caravan beating behind him. Closing thought. What does it mean when two civilizations trade not with words or treaties, but with objects designed to kill and preserve? In the exchange of salt for steel, were they building alliances, or were they building future enemies? The caravan was moving again. Not with haste, not with joy, but with the steadiness of tradition. 10,000 camels, 500 handlers, 30 guards, 3 scribes, and 1 ledger sealed in oiled goat leather and fastened with an iron pin. This ledger would not tell stories of battle. It would not recount glory. It would instead track salt, blades, beads, textiles, and the slow, dusty details of survival. And in doing so, it would preserve something far more enduring than valor: commerce. You are now walking beside such a caravan in the mid-14th century. You may be a European observer, a Berber trader, or a Tuareg guide. It makes no difference. What matters is that you are here, and you are learning the price of the caravan. Not just in coin, but in sweat, silence, and long-forgotten compromises. Camel logic, building the mobile market. Each camel carries a standard load: 2 salt blocks tied with woven hemp rope, sometimes 3 if the animal is strong or the journey short. But this is not a short journey. The route from Tagheza to Timbuktu and further south to Gao is long. The Azali caravans that run this route do so twice a year, once in winter and once in the tail end of summer. Caravan masters spend months in preparation. Weighing salt blocks, they must be nearly identical in size. Selecting camels with strong feet and tolerant temperaments. Choosing guards not for brute strength, but for reliability. Allocating space for trade goods: iron ingots, bolts of cloth, beads from Venice, and European tools. The inclusion of European steel is subtle. It is never in bulk. It rides tucked beside the drivers, tied in rags or hidden under flour sacks. Some fear theft. Others simply know its value rises with distance from the sea. Desert currency, the exchange table. By the time the caravan reaches a trading town like Gao or Walata, the rules are clear. In the open market, salt is stacked in neat rows, and its edges are knocked to show quality. The clearer and whiter the block, the higher its value. And this is how prices roughly unfold. 1 high-quality salt slab equals 10-12 days, grain for a family. 2 slabs equals a small iron dagger, or 3 pounds of millet. 4 slabs equals a bolt of rough cloth. 8 slabs equals a steel-tipped spear, often claimed to be from a northern forge. 15-18 slabs equals a worn longsword with a rewrapped hilt, and a blade marked with a maker's symbol, often European. Some Tuareg families carried steel heirlooms for generations. One oral story tells of a ghost sword, a blade that had crossed the desert more than 50 times but never been drawn in war. That is to say, a blade used only to command respect. The silent traders. Trade did not happen in chaos. It happened in quiet. In cities like Timbuktu, where mosques towered and scholars debated the Quran, the salt for steel trade operated in the background. The Tuareg did not speak much Arabic, and many European intermediaries did not speak Tamashek. So a third group emerged: the Jula West African traders, fluent in multiple tongues, often acting as linguistic and cultural brokers. They maintained price memory, remembering what was paid last year, last decade, last generation. They prevented deception, but they also benefited from it. Steel was not priced equally. A blade worth 8 slabs in Gao might cost 15 slabs in Walata. This wasn't inflation. This was distance, reputation, whispers. The Jula capitalized on these differences, becoming some of the most wealthy and quietly powerful traders in the region. Tuareg forts and European curiosity. Along some routes, the Tuareg established permanent encampments, not towns, but guarded stations, made from salt blocks and reinforced with stone. These tagasast outposts served multiple purposes. shelter during storms, safe water sources, negotiation centers, storage vaults for valuable goods, including steel. In one of these, the ruins of which were later studied by French colonial officers in the 19th century, explorers discovered a hollowed-out wall filled with rusted sword hilts, a worn European horseshoe, 2 coins, possibly Venetian grosso, worn smooth, a dagger inscribed in Latin, virtus in silentio. Was it planted later? Possibly, but records suggest Tuareg tribes were well aware of Europe not as a land of conquest, but as a source of certain objects that gave permanent edges to temporary lives. The maintenance of steel. In the Sahara, everything corrodes eventually. Even salt, the preserver of worlds, breaks under time and heat. Steel requires constant care, so Tuareg tribes developed surprising techniques. Blades were stored wrapped in animal fat cloths to prevent moisture exposure. Camel bone oil was sometimes used to clean rust. Handles were rewrapped in desert reed or goat sinew. When blades chipped, they were not sharpened but reshaped into smaller knives. Thus, a single European longsword could become 1 short sword, 2 daggers, 3 arrowheads, a bartering fragment. This unheroic cycle dismantling, repurposing, trading is how steel survived the desert. A European report from the edge. In 1392, a Castilian trader named Ramon de Mariles wrote a letter from Oran in present-day Algeria, describing the deep men of the sands. He writes, "They do not fear the sword but respect its weight. They prize the maker's stamp. They argue not over bloodlines but over salt. Their warriors are thin but carry themselves as kings. One showed me a blade marked from Toledo. I told him it was mine. He said, 'Now it is mine. The salt paid for it.'" Ramon never returned. Some say he died in a caravan ambush. Others suggest he joined the trade himself. The truth is lost. But his description captures a key truth. Ownership in the desert is not about origin. It's about transaction. The scholar's view, salt as stability. Islamic scholars in Timbuktu, writing during the height of the Mali Empire, often viewed salt as God's favor. The Quran references salt in symbolic ways, but scholars gave it legal and economic meaning. Salt was exempt from certain taxes due to its necessity. Steel, being a weapon of potential harm, was taxed more heavily when traded through official routes. This led to a shadow network, a quiet agreement between Tuareg caravans and sympathetic city leaders to bypass official scrutiny. In one fatwa issued around 1360, a scholar debates whether steel weapons traded for salt should be tithed differently than food. His answer is practical. The blade feeds differently, but it feeds. The caravans pause. The Azalai caravan reaches a midpoint settlement, a cluster of low stone buildings, tents, and tethered camels. In the fatting light, salt is stacked. Blades are unwrapped, inspected, and held to the sun. No one shouts, no coins clink. A Tuareg chief examines a sword. Its hilt is new, the blade old. A maker's mark reads de Ferrara. He nods, taps the salt block beside him, and walks away. The trade is complete. The caravan will rest here for 3 days. Repairs will be made. Sacks will be resewn. Ledgers will be updated. It is a dull, essential pause. This is how empires grow, not with conquest but with careful accounting. Closing thought. When 2 objects, salt and steel, hold equal value across cultures, what does that say about civilization? Are we more defined by what we can conquer or by what we're willing to carry? The caravan moves again, always south, always slow. By now, many salt blocks have been traded. Blades, bolts, and coins exchanged hands in silence. The night fires are smaller. The guards are quieter. Some of the younger camels limp, while a few older ones have already been left behind, bones wrapped in cloth, buried in sand. This, then, is the end of the great salt-for-steel circuit. Not a city, not a battlefield, but a transition. From the dry emptiness of the Sahara into the floodplains and forests of the Sahel, and into the growing realm of kings who knew how to turn both salt and steel into power. This section tells not just of objects traded, but of ideas transferred, alliances formed, and ambitions awakened. Because once you give someone a blade, what they do with it is no longer yours to decide. The kingdoms beyond the sand. South of the Sahara, kingdoms rose that had nothing to do with knights or castles. They were grassland monarchies, rooted in ancient oral tradition and fierce bureaucracies. Mali, Songhai, Kanem-Bornu, names often passed over in European records, but towering in African history. And each of them saw the salt caravans coming. And each of them asked, "What can we build with this?" The answer for rulers like Mansa Musa was simple: infrastructure, religion, and war. Salt fed the people, steel armed the guards, and both allowed the growth of cities, libraries, and armies. Timbuktu, the intellectual melting pot. By the mid-14th century, Timbuktu was no longer a dusty waypoint. It had become a thriving center of scholarship, trade, and quiet ambition. Here, salt and steel took on new meaning. Salt fed the city's wealth, steel protected it, and in the madrasas, students studied both the Quran and the price of a dagger from Tripoli. Tuareg merchants rarely lingered long in Timbuktu. They were desert dwellers. After all, but their impact was permanent. Some left behind more than salt. They left behind methods. How to store steel without rusting in damp climates. How to manage a caravan without losing men. How to fix a broken sword hilt using reed fiber and palm resin. These were small lessons, but like grains of salt, they accumulated. And one day, Songhai rulers stopped relying on Tuareg caravans. They built their own. The turning point, when the buyers became the smiths. You must understand something clearly. The Tuareg never intended to create steel-literate empires. But trade is not a one-way system. It teaches, even when unintended. As salt poured south and steel arrived with it, West African blacksmiths began to experiment. European steel was prized for its durability, but soon, local forges began producing effective weapons using both imported and regional materials. By the late 14th century, you can find blades of hybrid origin. European-style pommels with West African blades, swords with Arabic inscriptions, and Sahelian craftsmanship. Weapons blessed both by imams and tribal griots. This was not copying, it was adaptation. It was not colonization, it was integration. And it came with consequences. The shift in power. Before, Tuareg caravans controlled the salt routes. They determined access, protection, and terms. But by the late 1300s, Songhai kings, particularly Sunni Ali, began asserting control over trade corridors. Their soldiers, now equipped with steel-tipped spears and swords, began protecting and taxing caravans. Some Tuareg resisted, skirmishes erupted. In oral histories, one tale tells of a Tuareg leader who tried to extort tolls from a caravan guarded by Songhai troops. The answer came not in gold but in action. The guards, without speaking, drew blades of unmistakably European shape, and the Tuareg retreated. The symbolism was clear. The steel had changed hands. A record from a scholar, Pen. In 1401, a Moroccan scribe visiting Timbuktu recorded a conversation with a local merchant. I asked him where he found such a blade. He said it came from across the sea, by camel, then by river. But when I inquired whether it was Christian, he laughed. A blade has no religion, he said. Only the hand that holds it does. This is perhaps the clearest summary of what the salt-for-steel trade became. a transaction that slowly erased the line between giver and receiver. Salt's final role. As steel production became localized, salt remained central. It was harder to replace. It remained a stable currency, immune to inflation, valued across tribes, clans, and kingdoms. In some regions, slaves were traded by weight in salt. In others, salt slabs were used in dowries, legal fines, and inheritance divisions. In fact, salt became so woven into society that some cities banned its export without royal permission. The Tuareg continued to mine and trade salt, but their monopoly on weapons faded. Their power became spiritual, cultural, and symbolic, not military. A slower decline. It would be tempting to imagine a dramatic collapse of Tuareg control, a battle, a coup, an invasion. But that is not what happened. Instead, like salt left in open air, their influence evaporated slowly. By the 15th century, European steel still made its way into the desert, but now it arrived via different middlemen: Portuguese ships, local smiths, West African kings with coastal access. The Tuareg remained proud, veiled, riding under the desert stars, but their role shifted. From gatekeepers to guides, from traders to teachers, from owners to observers. A blade in a museum. Today, in a museum in southern Spain, a rusted longsword rests in a glass case. Its catalog entry reads, "Blade of possible Saharan origin, 14th century, recovered from Tuareg burial site, unknown maker." The steel is European, the wrapping is African. The pattern of wear suggests desert use. It is not a knight's sword, it is not a king's relic. It is a thing that passed through many hands, and told no story except the one its body carries. A weapon traded for salt, a tool held with purpose, an object without borders. Closing reflection. So much of history is written in the margins, in trade ledgers, salt trails, and the grooves worn into old blades. And somewhere in the fatting edge of the Sahara, a Tuareg caravan continues to move. Quiet, measured, eternal. The steel they once carried changed the fate of cities. The salt they mined outlived kingdoms. And in the dull, sandy silence of the desert, they still remember the lesson. Value is not in what you carry, it is in what you leave behind. Story 3. Sand and Chainmail: How Crusader Tactics Adapted to the Desert. You were trained to fight in forests, to ride through mud, stand in shield walls, and hold the line on green slopes. Your sword is heavy, your chainmail is thick, your training, designed for battlefields soaked in rain and blood. But now you are in dust, not mud. Beneath your feet is sand, not grass. The air chokes, the heat crushes, and your steel, your proud, shining armor cooks you alive. You are a crusader in the Levant, or perhaps in North Africa, and your enemy is not just an opposing army. It is climate, terrain, and time. The desert does not meet you in glorious combat. It erodes you. This is the story of how knights, used to temperate Europe, tried often slowly, clumsily, and reluctantly to adapt their tactics, gear, and expectations to a place they did not understand. It is a story not of great battles but of small changes, boring adjustments, and desperate improvisation. And those were the changes that allowed some to survive. Heavy armor, heavy costs. The chainmail hauberk, when dry and well-oiled, is a masterpiece of protection. But when worn under the Levantan sun, it becomes a furnace. Combined with a padded gambeson, a crusader's standard gear could weigh over 60 pounds, and most of that was heat-retaining. The first crusaders who marched into battle during the First Crusade, 1096-1099, discovered quickly that their usual attire didn't fit the land. Heat exhaustion killed as many as arrows did. Mail rust set in fast due to sweat and fine dust, which stuck to skin and steel alike. So they began to change, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Small changes, almost invisible on the battlefield, marked the beginning of a military adaptation to the desert. The first modifications. Early battlefield reports like those from the Siege of Antioch or the battles around Ascalon suggest that crusaders began cutting back gear. Shortened hauberks to allow for freer movement and less sweat accumulation. Removed or lightened coifs, replacing them with linen hoods. Added white surcoats not just for heraldry, but to reflect the sun's heat. Some even lined the insides of helmets with goat wool or cotton to insulate their skulls from the sun. These were not glorious changes. No songs were written about them, but they mattered. One anonymous knight wrote in his journal during the Second Crusade, "I wear less now, I fight better now, I sweat less now, and I still live." Horses and the desert, a failing strategy. European war horses' destriers were massive, strong, and bred for short bursts of violence. But in desert conditions, they were a liability. They drank more water, they tired quickly, they could not walk well on sand dunes or gravel plains, their hooves cracked. And so crusaders turned to local breeds, Barb horses, Arabians, and even camels, though knights were reluctant to ride them. It was not immediate, it was not widespread, but records from the Hospitaller Order in the early 12th century show stables in Acre and Tripoli being stocked increasingly with regional breeds. One knight, wounded and unable to mount his usual steed, recorded riding a donkey for weeks, not in shame but in practicality. He walked well, did not falter, he did not flee at arrows. "My destrier is dead. This mule lives, that is all." Adaptation was rarely elegant. The reality of desert sieges. The Crusader castles, those iconic, blocky behemoths that dot the Levant, were not built overnight, and they were not designed for fast warfare. Yet Crusaders learned to build with desert realities in mind. Walls were thicker to trap cool air inside. Cisterns were essential, more important than battlements. Many castles, like crack des Chevaliers, were built near natural springs or with massive rain catchment systems. In sieges, defenders wore light robes over their armor, both to shield from sun and to blend with stone during night raids. The Siege of Kerak, 1183, is especially telling. Saladin's forces surrounded the fortress. The defenders, European knights and local recruits, held out not just because of bravery, but because of logistical preparation. Pre-dug wells, ventilation channels, and storage of dried figs and salted goat. The battle was won not by the sword, but by good record-keeping and clever storage. Manuals and field notes. One of the lesser-known documents of Crusader history is De Arte Militari Orientis, an anonymously authored manual compiled sometime in the mid-13th century. Though lacking literary flair, it details dozens of tactical notes. Do not march in full armor until the 4th hour after sunrise. Let 3 men share one water skin. Trust none to carry only his own. Sand blinds the eyes and the soul. Bring linen strips to cover both. Accept dates. They are sweet but bind the stomach, which is good. There is no evidence this manual was widely distributed, but it represents a mindset shift, that the desert was not a temporary obstacle. It was the battlefield itself. Night tactics. In Europe, battle often began in the morning and ended by dusk. In the desert, Crusaders learned to move and fight at dawn or dusk, and in some cases at night. Their enemies, Seljuk Turks, Saracens, and Bedouin allies, used darkness as cover. Knights initially resisted this. Honor demanded visibility, but survival demanded stealth. Reports from battles near Damascus and Hattin describe Crusader ambushes at night, aided by guides familiar with local terrain. Knights removed their shining armor. They wore darkened mail, sometimes coated in ash or mud to prevent gleam. Footmen carried torches wrapped in oil-soaked cloth that burned low. It was not glorious, but it worked. The Battle of Hattin, A hard lesson. In 1187, the Battle of Hattin became one of the most devastating losses for the Crusaders. Trapped by Saladin's forces, suffering from heat, lack of water, and poor terrain knowledge, the Crusader army collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity. Knights wore full armor. They marched during the day. They carried few water reserves, assuming a short engagement. By the time the battle ended, most of the Crusader nobility was either dead or captured. The relic of the true cross was taken, and Jerusalem would fall shortly after. Historians often frame Hattin as a turning point, but perhaps it was simply the inevitable result of failing to adapt. The turn toward practicality. After Hattin, Crusader military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers began changing tactics more seriously. Smaller patrols, rather than full army marches. Use of local guides, often paid handsomely for loyalty. Training in ambush and defense, rather than just frontal assaults. Establishing oasis outposts as rest points and intelligence hubs. By the 13th century, European knights in the Levant no longer looked like the ones who left France or Germany. They wore lighter gear. They spoke Arabic phrases. They carried curved sabers alongside straight swords. They prayed with Latin words, but drank local wine, married local women, and bargained instead of charged. They were no longer conquerors. They were adapters. Closing thought. What do we call a knight who lays down his banner, sheds half his armor, drinks goat milk, and sleeps under desert stars? Is he still a knight? Or is he something more enduring? A soldier who learns, who changes, who survives not by might, but by accepting the shape of the world around him. The knight no longer wears a full suit of steel. Instead, he wears layers of cotton and linen, his chainmail shortened to a vest, his gauntlets replaced with rough leather gloves. His helmet has been modified, fitted with a cloth veil. He rides not a war horse but a lean barbed stallion, low to the ground and fast on sand. He still bears a sword. He still wears the cross, but he has begun to move like a different kind of warrior. And he is not alone. By the mid-13th century, Crusader military orders began doing something unexpected, not innovating for victory, but adjusting for survival. These were not tactical revolutions. They were slow, repetitive adaptations born of attrition, climate, and trial and error. This section explores the training camps, drills, and logistical evolutions that turned European knights into something new, desert-capable fighters. Changing the way knights trained. Traditional knightly training in Europe emphasized swordplay in armor, mounted jousting, shield work, long marches in chainmail. But these made little sense in the desert. Jousting was nearly impossible on uneven, sandy terrain. Long marches in armor led to heat stroke and dehydration. Even shield work became less relevant as fast, mobile skirmishing replaced set-piece battles. So the orders began retraining, often in open fields near castles or towns, using new methods. Shorter drills at sunrise or sunset, avoiding peak heat. Focus on dismounted combat, using lighter gear. Use of local swords, curved and single-edged, suitable for slashing from horseback. Emphasis on bow and sling use, particularly for footmen. Endurance training in arid conditions, including rationing water and surviving on minimal food. This wasn't glamorous. It was dull, precise, and practical. But it worked. Desert fortifications as training grounds. Crusader fortresses weren't just defense hubs. Many such as Crac des Chevaliers, Montfort, and Belvoir functioned as training posts. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, knights trained in mock ambushes in desert gullies. They practiced riding in loose formation, with long gaps between riders, mimicking the tactics of Bedouin raiders. They learned how to scatter and regroup, avoiding the rigid lines that once served them well in forests. Some forts built observation towers, allowing young knights to track caravan movements across vast distances, practicing patience, something many of them were not used to. There was also training in night marching, with torchless movement and silent hand signals. A Hospitaller record from 1231 lists. Week 3 night movement drills. No torches. Terrain, scrub hills. Objective, reach secondary cistern without alerting sentries. It could be a note from any modern military manual, but it was written in a chapel by candlelight in Latin. Equine re-education. War horses were more than animals. They were symbols of knightly prestige, but in the desert they were liabilities. So began the slow retraining of knights on lighter, local breeds barbs, Arabians and hybrids bred in crusader stables. Knights learned to ride lower in the saddle to minimize visibility, use fewer reins, allowing the horse to respond naturally to terrain, accept smaller, thinner saddles with less protection, feed and water sparingly, adjusting to the rations desert horses were used to. In some manuals, knights were instructed to walk beside their horses during long treks to conserve both rider and steed. One Templar wrote bitterly, "The beast is no destrier, but he does not die in the sun." Learning to eat like a desert soldier. Food was once a source of morale. Knights expected rich stews, cheese, bread, and meat. Supply trains were designed with these assumptions in mind. But as desert warfare dragged on, military kitchens adapted. Lentils, dates, figs, and flatbreads replaced meat-heavy diets. Salted fish and goat meat were dried and powdered, mixed with water into portable pastes. Camel milk mixed with mint or honey became a common drink. Some crusaders began fasting intentionally to train themselves for siege or caravan conditions. A 1244 Hospitaller provisioning scroll lists. 120 sacks of dried lentils. 80 wheels of hard cheese, non-perishable. 600 preserved date cakes. 10 amphorae of vinegar for wound treatment and drink dilution. No beef or pork requested. Not because they had abandoned their traditions, but because they had learned what the desert allowed. Medical realities of the Crusader desert. Wounds in hot climates fester. Swords, even when they don't kill, infect. Dust fills cuts, flies lay eggs in open sores, and water to clean them is scarce. Crusader field medicine slowly improved. Wound cleaning with vinegar became widespread. Linen soaked in date wine used to wrap burns. Camel dung poultices, adopted from Bedouin remedies for drawing out infection. Rest tents, once used only for nobility, became common for all ranks. Military orders began training dedicated lay healers, often older men or monks who no longer fought. They learned basic surgery, poultice making, and how to treat heat exhaustion, a silent killer. In one record from Acre, 1258, a knight's recovery is noted thus. He was bled once, then cooled with water under cloth, fed salted dates and shaded for 3 days. He rose on the 4th. This is not dramatic, but it is how men survived. Battle reports reflecting chain. Crusader chroniclers are often vague about tactics, but occasionally clues surface. In a report from the Battle of La Fourbe, 1244, one Templar writes, "We did not charge all at once. We scattered, we regrouped, we fought in bursts." Another account describes Hospitallers using fire pits and caltrops to slow enemy cavalry. And most tellingly, later Crusader commanders began using terrain-setting ambushes in wadi canyons, drawing enemies into dry gullies, and circling oases instead of attacking them directly. These were not sweeping victories, but they were tactical choices grounded in the desert's logic. New maps, new minds. European maps had long shown the Middle East in symbolic ways, with Jerusalem at the center, and little concern for topography or climate. But by the 13th century, new maps emerged in Crusader holdings, maps that marked reliable wells, navigable passes, market towns with friendly officials, wind directions by season. One such map, preserved in the Vatican archives, bears this note: the hills near El Tour will hide a column of 50 men. Sands softer here pass only before dawn. It's a small thing, but it marks the difference between spiritual geography and military survival. Closing thought. What if the greatest act of heroism in the Crusades wasn't the charge into battle, but the moment a knight unstrapped his mail, looked at the desert and said, "This place does not care who I am, only how I move through it." There is no trumpet, no banner fluttering in the wind. The battlefield is a low plain between dry wadis and a grove of palm trees so thin they provide no real cover. The air is not filled with war cries, it is still, breathless, stifling. And here in this empty silence, a knight kneels to adjust his linen veil. He has shortened his sword belt, lightened his shield, and wrapped his hands in goatskin. This is not the kind of warfare his father taught him. But his father never fought in Palestine or Cilicia or the Horn of Africa. This knight, now older, sun-darkened and worn by years of sand and battle, is the result of generations of slow adaptation of learning how to survive, and sometimes win, in a place that does not honor European armor or values. This final section explores what happened when all those small, dull changes, tactics, diet, movement, armor came together in real battle. This is not about conquest. This is about compatibility with the land. Guerrilla warfare and fragmented fights. By the later Crusades, particularly the 5th, 1217-1221, and 6th, 1228-1229, battles had changed in nature. There were fewer open-field clashes, more raids, more skirmishes, more maneuver than might. Knights accustomed to formation now moved in pairs and squads. Instead of leading with cavalry charges, they led with reconnaissance, often mounted scouts or desert-trained locals. Reports from battles in the Sinai and Negev describe Crusader patrols, moving at night, guided by the stars and local guides, using echo signals instead of horns or messengers, creating dummy camps, tents without soldiers, to mislead attackers, ambushing supply trains rather than attacking fortified positions. The victories were minor, but survival was the greater victory. One knight wrote, "I returned with only 3 men, but the enemy counted us 10. That was enough." Arrows in the wind. Crusaders never truly mastered mounted archery, a skill the Turks, Mamluks, and Bedouins excelled in, but they learned to fight against it. They adapted their formations, looser columns to reduce casualties from volleys, flanking movements to avoid direct exposure on open plains, use of wooden screens or carts, especially when moving across flat terrain, improvised shields from local materials, palm bark, camel hide stretched over frames. Some Crusader chroniclers lamented the lack of heroic engagement, but others came to accept a truth the desert taught plainly. It is not bravery to die in sunlight, it is vanity. Desert campaign logistics, the hidden battles. Crusader victories in the desert were rarely won in combat, they were won in planning rooms, storehouses, and water maps. At Montfort, an inland fortress, a document from 1272 lists camel loads of water skins packed 3 weeks ahead of a sortie, backup grain caches hidden in abandoned farmsteads. Neutral tribes paid in advance not to raid passing soldiers. Slings purchased from Arab craftsmen, 42 pieces, for use by footmen. This level of detailed planning, boring, meticulous, meant the difference between a force that reached its target and one that perished 3 days out. The knights who embraced this approach weren't praised in songs. They were administrators, scribes, logistics commanders. But their ink and patience saved more lives than any sword. The decline of the traditional knight. By the 14th century, the European model of the knight, the mounted warrior in full mail, bearing the cross on his chest and chivalry in his soul, was fading in the Levant. Not in identity, but in form. Military orders still operated. Knights still held castles, but their day-to-day reality looked very little like their origin stories. Many now wore local garb off-duty. Some spoke Arabic or Armenian better than French. Commanders hired local mercenaries as scouts and foot soldiers. Some married local Christian women, often Melkite or Coptic. Others converted, not often but sometimes. In a 1321 account, a Genoese knight named Niccolo della Spezia is described. He bore a cross on his banner, but on his person he wore the desert robes and his feet were bare as the Bedou. He prayed at matins, and at midday faced east again, silent. Was he a knight or something else? History does not say. The castles become islands. Castles like Crac des Chevaliers, Margat, and Chastel Blanc remained bastions of Crusader control well into the 13th century. But increasingly, they were islands not launching points for conquest, but fortresses of defense, diplomacy, and retreat. Within their walls, the remaining knights standardized desert protocols. Helmets with detachable veils to allow airflow. Use of local slings and javelins by outer patrols. Desert patrol manuals passed between commanders. One such manual, dated to 1287, reads, "The knight's life is preserved not by striking the blow, but by seeing the storm and hiding beneath stone until it passes." The tone is not triumphant. It is resigned, disciplined, and precise. Cross-cultural exchanges. Knights began to borrow and lend tactics, sometimes knowingly, often unconsciously. Crusaders began using Arab-style war drums, not just for morale, but for timing desert marches. Desert warriors began incorporating European steel into their weapon sets. Cloaks, once symbols of nobility, became practical garments dyed white or tan to reflect the heat. Both sides learned to build cisterns, hide stores of grain, and ration water precisely. The war was not only fought with swords, it was waged through adaptation of daily life. A battle that never happened. Near the end of the Crusader period, a small detachment of Templar knights rode toward Al-Karak, expecting battle. Instead, they found the city empty. The opposing force had already moved on. The desert had shifted the game again. They returned to their post, having never drawn swords, and one knight recorded, "We marched, we watched, we drank, we sweated, we fought nothing, but we did not die. This is perhaps the new kind of war." A dull sentence, but one soaked in the truth of desert conflict. The end of the Crusader Desert War. The last Crusader outposts fell in the late 13th century. Acre, the jewel of the kingdom, was lost in 1291. But the adaptations lived on. In the defensive strategies passed down to local Christians. In travel logs copied and used by European pilgrims. In military treatises that referenced Eastern War, full of dull but life-saving advice. No one wrote poetry about breathable tunics or camel saddles. But those were the things that kept men alive when all the banners had fallen. Final reflection. What, in the end, was the legacy of the Crusader knight in the desert? Not conquest, not victory, but adaptation, quiet, slow, and deeply human. The legacy is this: a man born to wield steel in rain, learning how to survive with linen in sand, not because he wanted to change, but because the desert demanded it. And he listened. Story 4. How monastic knights built way stations in the Sahara. A knight prays, but first he digs. He kneels not before an altar but beside a dry well, chiseling away at the sandstone, hopping to strike a hidden spring. His surcoat is stained, not with blood but with mineral dust. His sword is nearby, yes, but it is tied to the yoke of a donkey, which carries clay jugs and sacks of barley, not weapons. This knight belongs to no feudal army. He serves no king, and answers not to a general but to an abbot hundreds of miles away. His order wears crosses, but carries shovels and ledgers more often than lances. He is part of a forgotten endeavor, a network of monastic knights who, across the harshest reaches of the Sahara, built, stocked, and maintained way stations. Not fortresses, not churches, but simple oases made stable for pilgrims, traders, and yes, even enemies. This is the story of how monastic orders, both Christian and Islamic, turned survival itself into a kind of holy labor, building outposts of water and rest in a sea of sand. The origins of the desert way station. Long before the Crusades began, North Africa had monastic traditions stretching deep into antiquity. From the desert fathers of Egypt in the 3rd century CE to the Berber Christian communities in Roman times, the idea of finding God in emptiness was not new. But the orders that built structured way stations were different. By the 12th century, branches of military monastic orders, especially the Hospitallers and Templars, had begun extending their work beyond the Holy Land, responding to calls from the papacy to support Christian pilgrims and protect trade. This support didn't always mean swords. Sometimes it meant infrastructure. And so, funded by merchant tithes and religious donations, small groups of knights and lay brothers began to establish safe points across North African desert routes, particularly along the Maghreb-Sahel corridors and routes skirting the Sahara's edge. What a way station looked like. Forget your image of a towering castle or a fortified monastery. A typical desert way station, built by monastic orders, was low, often half buried in sand. Constructed from mud brick, salt stone, or locally sourced limestone. Surrounded by a wall no higher than a man's chest. Contained a central cistern, a shaded enclosure, and 2 or 3 rooms. Included storage for dried food, olive oil, medical herbs, and simple tools. Bore no flags, only a carved cross or painted symbol near the entrance. One station, excavated in the 20th century near modern-day Gardia in Algeria, had a stone embedded in the door frame. In aqua et humilitate, Deus invenitur. In water and humility, God is found. Building with boredom. Construction was slow, dull, repetitive. The knights weren't architects. They followed simple plans drawn by itinerant monks who had experience building in the Judean hills or Cyprus. These plans emphasized shade over strength, ventilation over height, durability over decoration. They hired local laborers, often Muslim, and paid them in food, salt, or coin. Some shared tools, meals, and occasionally prayers. The chroniclers rarely mention this, but local cooperation was not rare. In one letter preserved in a Hospitaller archive, a knight writes, "The Moors helped us lay the stone. They said nothing but worked well. We shared dates and did not speak of God." Not unity, but coexistence forged in sand. Water first always. Every decision at the way station began with one principle: find water. The knights were taught how to identify underground springs and seasonal aquifer, skills borrowed from Berber nomads and Egyptian monks. They learned to look for clusters of tamarisk and acacia trees, cracks in dried riverbeds, moisture under rock outcroppings, trails worn by animals during dry months. They dug shafts, sometimes as deep as 40 feet, lining them with limestone and fitted with hand-cranked pulleys or rope and bucket systems. In some sites, they redirected rainwater using mud canals called qanats in Persian, though different in structure, and pooled it into cisterns lined with plaster and oil. Maintenance was relentless. Sand filled every opening. Wind cracked every wall. Algae grew in every pool. One knight wrote, in a dusty margin of his psalter, "To keep a well clean is more tiresome than prayer, but I would not live without either." Salt and provisions. These were not self-sufficient monasteries. Supplies had to be brought in carefully measured, pre-portioned, and recorded with obsessive detail. Common provisions stored in desert way stations included salted goat meat, barley flour in hardtack, date cakes wrapped in palm fiber, small amphorae of vinegar, bundles of herbs, sage, myrrh, coriander, medical kits, bronze tools, linen strips, vinegar bottles, and curiously, writing materials. Many way stations kept logs of who passed through, names, numbers, supplies taken, water used. These records were sent back to coastal monasteries once a year, usually by passing merchants. In one surviving ledger dated 1178, a scribe noted, 17 men passed, 8 pilgrims, 5 Saracens, 4 muleteers, 3 barrels drawn, no conflict. It is bureaucratic, lifeless, and yet this log may be the only proof those people ever existed. The monastic healer knight. Most way stations had no ordained priest, but they often had a lay healer or apothecary-trained knight. These men knew how to treat heatstroke, shade, vinegar patients, how to disinfect wounds, boiled water, wine, myrrh, how to mix simple soothing balms, when to say nothing and let the patient rest. They wore robes with a red cross, though often covered in sand. They listened more than they spoke. They kept no oath of silence but preferred it anyway. Pilgrims, whether Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, came not for protection, but for restoration. Some stayed for hours, others for days. And then they moved on. Between faiths. The Sahara was not entirely Christian, nor entirely Muslim. It was layered. There were Jewish traders, Sufi mystics, Orthodox imams, Coptic Christians, Berber tribesmen, and wandering philosophers. At the way stations, this diversity was tolerated, perhaps not celebrated, but understood as part of the land. One Templar record from the early 1200s describes a group of Hajj pilgrims resting at a way station, run by monastic knights. They were given water, dates, and rest. No words exchanged. They left at sunset. No quarrel followed. This was not diplomacy. This was practicality. Water erased doctrine. Closing thought. When a knight built a wall, dug a cistern, and rested a stranger, did he protect the faith? Or did he protect something older and deeper than dogma? Perhaps the orders who built these places understood one thing very clearly. In the desert, faith is important, but water is essential. You hear no bells, only wind. The monastic way station stands like a forgotten tooth, half buried in sand, its mud brick walls patched with cloth and palm bark. There is no chapel here, only a shaded alcove carved into the eastern wall where a cross has been etched beside the Arabic word for peace. Arabic Sin, Arabica, Arabic Lam, Arabic Alif, Arabica, Arabic Mim, Salam. Here prayer is whispered, if it is said at all. This is not a fortress of grandeur, nor a house of song. It is a machine for surviving, part shelter, part hospital, part warehouse, and its custodians are not famous. They are men whose names rarely appear in chronicles. This section explores the daily life within these way stations, the structure of their operations, the odd spiritual rhythm that governed them, and the role they played in stabilizing long-distance travel through a landscape indifferent to all creeds. The monastic clock without chimes. Back in Europe, monasteries ran by the rule of St. Benedict or local monastic codes. Time was measured by bells, sun positions, canonical hours, and strict discipline. In the Sahara, the bell did not carry far, and so the brothers of the desert learned to mark time by the movement of shadows across a courtyard, the bending of acacia, branches and midday wind. The call of birds who migrated seasonally. The temperature change at dusk. Daily routine at a way station was less rigid than in cloistered monasteries, but still followed a structure. Dawn, open cistern, check water levels, sweep sand from thresholds. Mid-morning, prepare food, inventory supplies, patch cracks in walls. Midday, rest, prayer, reading if books were available. Late afternoon, receive travelers, distribute food and water. Sunset, record entries in the ledger, seal stores, prayer. Night guard rotation, maintenance, cooling clay stores. This was not a schedule driven by liturgy, but by necessity. The dull but sacred duty of inventory. If God dwelled in the Sahara, he likely lived in the ledger room. Each way station kept meticulous records, not because anyone demanded it, but because survival depended on it. Ledgers were bound in leather, often wrapped in cloth to protect from sand. They used charcoal ink, which resisted fatting, and wrote in Latin, Arabic, or a blend of both. A single entry might look like this, translated. 15th day of safe summer, 1209. Water drawn, 41 skins. Travelers, 9, 3 pilgrims, 4 merchants, 2 riders. Provisions taken, 5 barley cakes, 3 oil jars, 2 date bundles. Disputes, none. Scribe Brother Thibault. These notes were duplicated monthly and entrusted to merchants returning north or east, ensuring that the wider order knew which stations remained active. The tedium was deliberate. You did not remember names, you remembered numbers. The salt rituals. Salt was currency, medicine, and preservative. At way stations, it also became sacramental. Salt was used to clean wounds. Mixed with ash, it became a paste for cleaning armor and tools. A pinch of salt was added to water for first-time guests, symbolizing safe passage. In rare services, salt was pressed into a symbolic cross, laid on the table where Mass might have been held. Salt made things last. It was the language of permanence in a place where nothing stayed. One night healer wrote in a surviving note, "I have no relic, no bell, but I have salt, and with this I anoint the road." The agreements made without words. Formal treaties were rare in the deep desert, but understandings developed. Many way stations maintained arrangements with local tribes, Tuareg, Sanhaja, or Arab nomads. These were not written. They were kept alive through gift exchanges, dates, salt, steel fragments. Wells shared in drought, with quiet mutual recognition. Respect for burial grounds. Avoiding each other's holy days. Sometimes these agreements failed. There are scattered notes in monastic archives about raids, stolen grain, or threatened wells. But more often, there is nothing which suggests that most such arrangements held quietly for years, even decades. In the desert, trust was not shown with words. It was shown by not being attacked. The books they carried. A desert way station might keep only 2 or 3 texts, chosen for durability and utility. Common texts included a psalter, often written in large script for ease of reading in dim light. A Latin-Arabic glossary, handwritten, updated as new terms were learned. A medical tract, often copied from a Benedictine source or adapted from Arabic manuscripts. These were not scholarly centers. The men who copied these texts were not monks in the European sense, but practical scribes, often trained in both letters and labor. Some notes in the margins record. Water ratios for tea and poultices. Arabic terms for bone fractures. Passages for comfort to the dying. You will not find these texts in libraries. Most turned to dust, but for those who held them they were sacred. Who slept here? Way stations did not discriminate. Knights, pilgrims, traders, refugees. Once, according to a fragmentary record, even a wandering bishop from Nubia. All were given. Water, 1 skin per traveler. Food 1 ration per day per person. A place to sleep, usually a mat under shade. In exchange, travelers were expected to leave no trace, record their names, route, and destination, abide by silence at night, unless in distress. Few stayed more than a day, some longer. No one was turned away except those who stole. Punishment was simple: banishment from the cistern, a death sentence effectively. But it was rarely enforced. The desert already killed. The nights had no need to add to its toll. The quiet deaths. Some died here. They were not buried with pomp. No tombstones. Just small rock cairns or shallow graves marked with a symbol: a circle for strangers, a cross for Christians, a crescent for Muslims, a star for the rare Jews who passed through. The dead were recorded in ledgers, but often without names. One line from a record dated 1193. A man died, alone, skin cracked, gave no name, was buried with water and fig. No hymn, no bell. Only the act. And then the sweep of wind. Closing thought. Was this holiness, or simply endurance? The men of these way stations were not martyrs, not saints, just tired hands moving stone, cleaning dust, pouring water, and sometimes writing lines no one would read. But perhaps in the silence of the Sahara, that was enough. To serve not with sword but with shade, to protect not with walls but with water. The well has long since dried. The walls have collapsed into piles of brick and dust. The ledgers have vanished, and yet the outline of the way station remains, faint but unmistakable, like a scar across a dune. A few stones still form part of the perimeter. Near the center, bits of fired clay and rusted nails poke through the sand. There's no plaque, no inscription. But to those who know what to look for, the subtle indentations of a cistern, the remnants of cooking fires, the unnatural flatness of the terrain, this was once a place where water, rest, and quiet mercy were offered. This final section reflects on the decline, disappearance, and hidden legacy of these monastic night way stations, not just in history, but in the geography of survival. The fade into silence. No one conquered the way stations. There were no sieges, no orders to abandon them. Most were simply forgotten. As caravan routes shifted due to politics, new trade patterns, or changing access to wells, many way stations became irrelevant. Others were buried gradually by encroaching dunes, overtaken by time, not war. A few remained active into the 15th century, according to occasional records from larger monasteries near the Mediterranean. But by the 16th century, nearly all had disappeared from maps. In a 1509 letter from a Portuguese friar stationed in Iran, "We passed ruins we were told were from the Frankish monks. There were signs of a cistern, but the wind had made a lyre of the stone." That was their end, not with destruction but with erasure by nature. The surviving fragments. Some clues survive. A cracked cross pendant, found near a dried-up well in modern Mali, worn smooth. A ledger page preserved in a European archive, bearing Arabic annotations and Latin numerals. A stone basin, discovered by Tuareg nomads and still used for collecting rainwater centuries later. A wall inscription in a cave near Gadames, with a barely visible Latin script, Nullus peregrinus in terra Dei. No traveler is a stranger in God's land. And in some desert songs rare, oral traditions passed among camel drivers, there are cryptic verses that mention the pale men who gave water and asked nothing. They are never named, but they are remembered. In absence more than presence. The crossroads of pilgrimage. Perhaps the most lasting impact of these stations was not what they preserved, but what they enabled. In facilitating desert travel, they made possible pilgrimages to Jerusalem from the west and south, trade routes between Maghreb and Sahel regions, passage for scholars, diplomats, and exiles, Islamic and Jewish travelers occasionally noted these stations in journals, not always by name, but as the Christian house with water, or the place of the Red Cross. They were not seen as threats, but as fixtures, odd but useful, foreign but reliable. Like an oasis itself, expected but never taken for granted. Lessons passed forward. After the decline of the Crusader and monastic presence in North Africa, local Muslim communities and nomadic groups often took over the way stations or their remains. Many rebuilt wells. Some repurposed cisterns into Islamic ribats, spiritual and military outposts that served similar purposes. There is no evidence of hostility, no desecration. Just reuse. As if everyone understood, water did not belong to one faith. And neither did shelter. Echoes in architecture. The desert stations influenced later colonial-era outposts, built by French, Spanish, and Ottoman forces centuries later. Military engineers in the 19th century frequently consulted older maps and oral traditions, many of which pointed to ruined Christian houses as markers of past infrastructure. One French officer wrote in 1862, "Our well diggers found an old shaft lined with stone, deeper than modern ones. The locals say it was made by the silent monks. We reinforced it. The water was good." Even in ruin, the design held. The functionality endured. Even when the builders had been gone for 400 years. A philosophy of service. What kind of knight leaves behind the sword? What kind of order builds walls not to repel enemies, but to catch rain? The monastic way stations in the Sahara never achieved glory. They were not sites of miracle or martyrdom. They did not become pilgrimage destinations. But they demonstrated a particular kind of devotion. Not to power, but to provision. Not to conversion, but to care. Not to victory, but to visibility for anyone who needed to survive. One knight whose name is lost etched a simple prayer into a plaster wall, still faintly visible today. If God sees this place, may he also see the tired man who comes thirsty. That may have been enough. Final reflection. The desert does not preserve stone well, but it preserves memory strangely. In the wind-carved walls and the cracked cisterns, there is a memory not of conquest but of care, not of blood but of balance. Perhaps that is what these monastic nights offered. Not a fortress, not a faith, but a pause, a place where the sword was laid down, where the well came first. And when they vanished, the desert kept going quietly, patiently, as it always had. But in certain places, when the wind is right and the sand shifts just enough, you can still find the outline of a wall. And beneath it a basin, waiting to catch rain. Story 5, The Longest Lent, Surviving with Faith and Dried Dates. Lent begins not with a feast, but with an absence. No meat, no fat, no celebration. For 40 days you are meant to reflect, deny, and endure. It is the church's reminder that sacrifice leads to redemption. But here in the fringes of the Sahara, Lent becomes something far more literal. For the Christian knights stationed in remote outposts, leading small groups of pilgrims or holding lonely watch along trade routes, fasting was not ritual, it was necessity. There was no feast to start with. There was only a stretched food supply, a rationing plan, and the slow, sun-baked arithmetic of survival. This is not the story of glorious denial, but of endurance in dull deprivation. A Lent where the challenge wasn't resisting temptation, it was making dried dates last long enough to see the next supply caravan. This story begins with a calendar and with a dwindling stockpile. The start of the season. In a small hospitaller station near the salt flats of Tagheza, a knight named Brother Guillaume notes in his personal log. Ash Wednesday, we have 11 sacks of barley, 3 jars of goat fat, 46 bundles of dates, no meat since Epiphany. We begin Lent now, not with humility but arithmetic. His record is one of dozens discovered in a water-damaged manuscript, likely bundled with routine reports, never intended for fame. From this we learn: the Knights marked Lent, even in isolation. Their fasting was not symbolic, it was life-threatening if mismanaged. The staple food became dried dates, high in sugar, shelf-stable and locally sourced. To keep faith, they had to learn to ration with mathematical precision. Rationing in the time of prayer. A small outpost might house 3 knights, 5 lay brothers, 2 scribes, 1 camel handler, 1 local interpreter. That's 12 mouths, 3 prayers per day, and 1 storeroom with locked rations. Each man could receive per day a handful of dates, about 100 grams, a half portion of barley gruel, water half skin in morning, quarter skin at night. All of this was recorded not just in ledgers, but in prayer cycles. A surviving monastic guide from the period includes a note. At sex, distribute 2 palms worth of dates. Recite Psalm 41. At Vespers, share the vinegar cup. At Matins, only water. The rhythm of Lent merged with the rhythm of scarcity, not a sacrifice of choice, but of circumstance shaped by land. The date palm, tree of survival. In the desert, the Phoenix dactylifera, the date palm, was more than a plant. It was a calendar, a cupboard, and a sign of hope. Knights learned to recognize palms with the darkest, ripest fruit, often growing wild near oasis edges. Store dates in woven sacks, hung in shade to reduce spoilage. Mix crushed dates with barley flour and vinegar to create cakes easy to ration, difficult to chew, but dense with energy. Distribute seeds to passing traveler in exchange for news or prayer requests. Dates were sweet, yes, but they became, ironically, a symbol of endurance in bitterness. One knight wrote, "The dates taste like the body of Christ, sweet only because I hunger, blessed only because I chew them slowly." Faith on empty stomachs. During Lent, the readings continued. The Psalms were chanted in Latin, often beneath blanket-draped shade or beside flickering oil lamps. But as weeks wore on, energy waned, voices faded. Some nights fell asleep mid-recitation. Some forgot verses they had known for decades. One entry records a monk who spoke only the word Amen for 5 days. The community persisted. They read from a psalter missing its final pages. They recited from memory when their ink froze during a sudden cold snap. They sang, without melody, without volume, but with quiet insistence. There were no sermons, just scripture, routine, and the occasional crack of date pits underfoot. Encounters on the dust road. Lent did not shield them from travelers. During these weeks, caravans still passed, merchants still knocked, pilgrims still stumbled in, exhausted and confused. The knights gave what they could. Half portions wrapped in reed. 1 jug of clean water, shared among 3. A quiet blessing, spoken without excess. One day, a group of Coptic Christian merchants arrived, having lost their guide. The knights offered shelter, no food, just shelter. They prayed together in 2 languages, 2 traditions, 1 tone. The knights logged notes. They gave us dried melon. We gave them our last vinegar. The trade was uneven but kind. Even in hunger, the rules of hospitality held. A meal to remember. On the 32nd day of Lent, supplies were nearly gone. But that night, after Vespers, they shared a mixture of date wine and crushed garlic, a cake made from ground fig seeds and salt, water boiled with desert herbs, likely mint and rue. It was a makeshift feast. One monk wept while chewing. A letter from a distant monastery, received months later, preserved only this line in reply: "Your fast was longer than ours. Your table was poorer, but your faith was full." Closing thought. What is fasting when the food was never plentiful? What is faith when you worship with cracked lips and swollen feet, counting dates like rosary beads? Perhaps it is this: to believe even when the cupboard is bare, to give even when the ration is halved, to fast not for God's approval but because there is no other choice, and to remain gentle even then. By the third week of Lent, silence grows heavier. Not holy silence, not meditative quiet, but a hush shaped by fatigue, cracked lips, and the slow curling inward of the body. Hunger doesn't make you dramatic in the desert, it makes you deliberate. Movements become slow. Words are measured. The nights no longer pace the walls of the way station. They sit more often, stare longer, wait more patiently for what rarely comes: a cloud, a bird, a knock on the door. And always they count. Not only the days until Easter, but the seeds inside each date, the water skins left in the rack, the prayers they've memorized in case the psalter fades. Lent was meant to remind them of Christ's suffering. But here, suffering is not theological, it is practical and extremely boring. The mathematics of monastic survival. Brother Guillaume's journal continues. His handwriting grows smaller. Day 23. 7 sacks of barley remain, 34 bundles of dates. One is rotting. We have begun to count the seeds as a measure of passing. 12 dates per man, 1 seed each, 1 day further. The counting of date seeds becomes a ritual, not religious, not symbolic, just grounding. Each night after Compline, the brothers place their seeds in small piles, 1 for each eaten. A tally is recorded, then brushed away. The next day, they begin again. This monotony, this ritual of counting the same thing, the same way, replaces the clock. They know Lent is long, but they no longer know how long. The liturgical calendar has become a cycle of seeds. When supplies become sacrament, their oil is gone, so are the figs. Only dates, barley, and a single jar of vinegar remain. So they innovate. Barley tea becomes the main drink. Boiled, strained, served lukewarm in clay cups. A date mash is thinned with hot water to create a thin paste shared communally in a chipped bowl. Vinegar is rationed not for taste, but for cleaning wounds and purifying water. The brothers stop referring to meals. They call them divisions. One scribe writes, Division 27, 1 cup mash, 1 barley strip, 3 seeds, still breathing. It is dry, it is clinical, it is survival. The theology of emptiness. Without sermons, without music, without feast days, their Lent becomes a kind of monastic hollowing. They begin to contemplate what it means to suffer without purpose. Some quote scripture, others stare. One young knight, previously loud and argumentative, begins each prayer by whispering, "Let me remain calm." A visiting monk once told them that the goal of Lent was to remove distraction. Here, there is no need for such instruction. Hunger does that. Silence does that. The ceaseless wind, the dry skin, the weight of routine, these become the new liturgy. They are not noble in their suffering. They are not joyful. They are not tragic. They are quietly determined. A camel arrives but offers nothing. On day 28, a rider appears. A lone Tuareg courier, wrapped in indigo cloth on a tired camel. He carries no goods, only a small leather pouch with a rolled message, a delay notice from a monastery in Tripoli. The caravan of resupply is 2 weeks late, sandstorms. The knight in charge, Brother Henry, nods. Tell them we are still counting. The courier drinks 1 ladle of water. He does not speak. He does not remove his veil. He gestures a blessing, perhaps a joke, perhaps sincere, and leaves before sunset. He gives no dates. He asks for none. A note in the ledger. Each Lent, the brothers are required to make an entry summarizing their observance. A record not for readers, but for archival continuity. This year's is shorter than usual, written in faded ink. Lent observed, dried dates sustained us. No meat, no wine, no illness recorded, praise be. They do not mention how many nights they went without speaking. They do not mention how two of the youngest stopped writing altogether. They do not mention the dream that all of them had on the same night of a table, full and overflowing, vanishing as they approached. That would not be proper. So they write only what's needed. And then they return to work. The temptation of the valley. On day 35, Brother Guillaume considers breaking the fast, not for sin, not for weakness, but because the last bundle of dates is infested with beetles. They debate burning them. Instead, they pick the bugs off one by one. Later that evening, a local Berber boy arrives with a handful of dried cactus fruit, offered freely. The brothers accept, but divide it into 5 parts to be eaten after Lent, as a gesture of gratitude. The boy says nothing. He leaves before the wind rises. And still they wait. Palm Sunday without palms. No branches grow here. So on the 39th day, they walk out of the station and gather dried grass, weave it into cords, and hang them from the lintel of the well. It is not ceremony, it is an act of remembering. Their chant is only 2 verses long. There is no mass, no procession, only the wind and the creak of a weathered door. But they mark the moment. And then they return to rationing the final barley cake. Closing thought. Lent is supposed to prepare the soul for Easter, for rebirth, for glory, for celebration. But in the heart of the desert, Lent is not followed by trumpets or feasts, only a slightly larger ration, a cooler night, and the continued act of staying alive. Perhaps that is enough. To fast not for holiness, but for function. To pray not for miracles, but for patience. To count each date, each seed, each footstep, and to keep going anyway. Easter morning arrives without light. There is no sun, yet only the pale pre-dawn glow that touches nothing with warmth. There is no incense, no choir, no church bells echoing across hills, just a few tired men, wrapped in wool and silence, standing by a low stone table outside the well house, each holding a single dried date. This is Easter in the desert. After 40 days of rationing, praying, and watching the wind sculpt the sand into ever-changing shapes, the fast has ended. But the hunger, the real, slow, bodily hunger, has not. And yet the brothers do not feast. There is no abundance to return to, only slightly more, a bit of extra barley, an extra handful of lentils, 1 preserved fig split 7 ways. This final section tells of the strange, quiet resurrection that takes place after a Lent of true emptiness, not of triumph or glory, but of resilience, of intention, and of the unremarkable but profound choice to continue. The first meal after. Brother Guillaume records it plainly. Easter shared water, 8 dates per man, 1 fig, warm mash. No wine, no eggs, no meat. Just a warm mash, a porridge of barley, salt, and boiled herbs, sweetened slightly with date paste, heated not for flavor but to soften the day. Still, for those who had grown used to chewing each bite 40 times, warmth itself was a gift. After eating, no one speaks, not out of reverence but because the effort seems excessive. They sit for a while in the courtyard, listening to the stirring of camels, the rustling of wind through date palm branches, and the buzz of desert flies returning with the warmth. Their resurrection is not a flash of divine light. It is quiet digestion, the absence of pain, the faint sense that they will make it through another week. Writing the resurrection. The traditional rule of the monastic orders requires a written reflection on Easter, however brief, something to be stored, read aloud the following year, or forgotten in an archive. This year's entry from the outpost near Tagheza reads, "Christ is risen. So too have our appetites. We wait for the caravan, but do not despair." The fig was sweet. It is not scripture, it is not grand, but it is enough. They write it on the back of a dry date sack, using leftover ink diluted with vinegar. It curls as it dries. They leave it on the shelf next to a bowl of sorted seeds. The caravan finally arrives. On day 48, 8 days after Easter, the supply caravan appears. 5 camels, 2 handlers, a donkey dragging a broken axle. They bring oil, barley, and vinegar, dried fish wrapped in palm leaves, a new psalter from the monastery in Marrakesh, 23 bundles of dates. There is no celebration, just inventory as always, counting sacks, weighing rations, checking for spoilage. Still, there is a sense of return, not to wealth, but to margin, to the space between bare survival and comfort. They do not eat immediately. They store half, share a third, and boil the rest into a thick meal that takes all afternoon to prepare. One brother smiles, that is enough. A changed rulebook. After that Lent, something changes in their practice. The oldest knight begins rewriting the outpost's rationing guidelines not as emergency notes, but as primary policy. He writes, "Count dates before counting days. Water for guests comes before water for cleaning. Sing when your mouth is too dry to pray. Keep 1 fig uneaten always, even if you must hide it." These are not doctrinal rules, but they become part of the unspoken monastic code of the desert. Future brothers will read them. They may not understand why they matter until they, too, go through a season of emptiness. The first night after. That evening, under a moon too full to ignore, the brothers do something rare. They stay awake. No vespers, no formal prayer, just storytelling. One recalls a Lent in France, when he broke the fast with mutton stew. Another remembers the taste of wine and warm bread. One simply says, "This Lent I learned to eat slowly and to stop before I was full." They laugh, not loudly, but with the joy of not being on the edge anymore. In the morning they will clean the storeroom, repair the pulley on the well, open a new ledger, return to normal routines. But tonight they exist between fast and feast, between what was denied and what has returned. A final addition to the wall. Near the edge of the outpost, carved faintly into the stone above the cistern, someone adds a new line, perhaps Brother Guillaume, perhaps another. It reads, "Easter came late, but it came. The dates held, so did we." There is no signature, just the chiseling of a dull knife into soft rock. Final reflection. Easter is often portrayed with shining light, angels, and trumpets, but in the desert, it arrives quietly in the form of a softened mash, a new bundle of dates, and a full ladle of water. No miracle, no vision, just enough. The empty stomach becomes a sacred space. The returned ration becomes a resurrection. The act of enduring becomes its own kind of prayer. The Lent was long, but the faith did not break. And in that, the desert did not win. Story 6, Armor in the Heat, the logistics of desert warfare. The knight stares at his armor like it's a trap. His hauberk, carefully oiled and folded, lies in the shade of a mud brick wall. It weighs nearly 25 pounds. His gambeson, thick, quilted, and sweat-stiffened, hangs like a curtain. His helmet, a battered great helm lined with wool, sits on the table. None of it is damaged. All of it is deadly. Not to the enemy. To him. He is stationed in a crusader outpost along the Jordan Valley, where the sun does not simply shine at presses. Wearing full gear here is not valorous. It is a test of survival. Even before battle, the body begins to fail. This story is not about glory. It is about logistics. The boring, frustrating, life-saving details behind what it took to wear armor in a climate that never forgave. Armor born in the north. Let's begin with the basics. European armor, especially in the 11th, 13th centuries, was designed for cold climates, short engagements, close quarters combat. Visibility and intimidation. A standard kit for a knight during the early Crusades included a full mail hauberk, often to the knee, a gambeson underneath multiple layers of padded linen, coif and chausse, mail hood and leggings, surcoat eventually added, sometimes with family crest or cross, helm from nasal to great helm styles, combined weight, upwards of 60 pounds depending on build and additions, perfect for Western Europe, a death sentence in the desert. The first deaths were from the sun. There are many records of knights collapsing before combat during the First Crusade. Contemporary chroniclers mention symptoms modern readers would recognize: slurred speech, vomiting after marching, delirium and wandering behavior, sudden collapse, all signs of heat stroke and dehydration. But at the time, these were sometimes interpreted as weakness or even divine punishment. One chronicler, writing after the siege of Antioch, noted, "Some fell before drawing blade. Their mouths were dry. Their hands could not grip. It was as if the sun itself cursed them." Medical understanding did not yet separate gear failure from spiritual failure. It would take decades of losses to see that the heat itself was the enemy. The experiments begin. By the time of the Second and Third Crusades, adjustments to armor were being recorded in dull but telling detail. From a Hospitaller provisioning document, circa 1180. Issue of half hauberk permitted. Coifs may be replaced with linen wraps. Helms shall be carried, not worn until the hour of combat. Surcoats made of white linen encouraged. Some knights, especially those posted longer in desert regions, began cutting their mail short, removing the sleeves below the elbow, shortening the skirts to allow airflow. They also began to punch ventilation holes in helms, line the inside of helmets with camel wool or cotton padding, wear scarves or keffiyehs beneath or over headgear, soak their tunics in water before long marches, ineffective long-term, but comforting for a few minutes. These changes were rarely mentioned in heroic songs, but in ledgers and letters, they appear with boring regularity. The realities of marching in metal. Let's say a knight needed to travel 10 miles in daytime conditions, roughly 100 degrees F, 38 degrees C, dry and with little shade. In full armor he would lose up to 2 liters of water per hour. Begin experiencing muscle cramping by mile 3. Require rest every 45-60 minutes, more if carrying a shield. Have to remove helmet every 20 minutes to cool head. Risk unconsciousness without water within 3-4 hours. Hence, by the mid-13th century, knights rarely traveled in full kit. Instead, they carried helm on the saddle, mail folded in baggage, weapons at the ready but rarely drawn. Some even replaced the gambeson with lighter linen tunics, sacrificing protection for ventilation. The result, fewer deaths from heat, but also a change in tactics. Fighting with less. As armor lightened, so too did the methods of combat. By the later Crusades, knights were fighting on foot more often, especially in ambush or canyon combat, using bucklers instead of full kite shields, wielding lighter swords or curved sabers, sometimes borrowed from local styles, avoiding prolonged combat during peak sun hours. This wasn't cowardice, it was logistical realism. A knight who survived the march had more value than one who looked impressive at sunrise and collapsed before noon. The repair cycle. Armor maintenance became a full-time job. Desert wind carried fine sand that infiltrated chainmail links, grinding them down with every movement. Sweat mixed with salt accelerated corrosion. Thus, outposts developed routines. Oil application every 3 days, using goat fat or imported olive oil. Chainmail laid out on stones to air and dry, sometimes even scrubbed with sand and cloth. Metal repair kits became standard issue: pliers, rivets, small tongs. Rotated armor, where so knights had time to clean and rest between outings. At some stations, records show armor being loaned and rotated between patrols, ensuring no one piece was overused. The armor wasn't glorified anymore. It was equipment, and it had to be treated as such. Desert variants, hybrid armor. The final innovation wasn't a single invention but a trend, adopting local armor techniques. In regions closer to Egypt, Syria, and the Maghreb, some Crusader outposts began incorporating lamellar armor, small, overlapping plates sewn into cloth, better for heat dispersion. Leather scale armor, treated with oil for water resistance. Mail and cloth hybrids, mixing chainmail on the torso with cotton sleeves. Helmets lined with reed and wool, not metal alone. These were not widely adopted. They challenged European norms of knightly image, but in the field, they were used. And the ones who used them lasted longer. Closing thought. We remember knights as clad in gleaming steel, banners high, never flinching. But in the desert, that steel boiled their flesh. The banners wilted, and flinching was the difference between heat stroke and survival. To wear armor in the Sahara was to play a game of slow defeat. To survive, the knight had to bend not the knee, but the image. He had to unstrap, to loosen, to change. Not because he was weak, but because the sun was stronger than pride. The problem with tradition is that it doesn't sweat. It doesn't gasp for air, stagger under weight, or collapse halfway through a patrol. But men do. And in the brutal, wind-choked deserts from North Africa to the Jordan Valley, those who clung to the chivalric ideal of full armor mail from neck to knee, surcoat, helm, sword began to learn the lesson the hard way. This section explores how logistics officers, engineers, and experienced desert veterans within military orders like the Hospitallers, Templars, and Teutonic Knights began to change how they thought and, more importantly, how they equipped their forces. These weren't battlefield decisions made under duress. These were boring, administrative, slow evolutions made through stock checks, supply delays, injury reports, and letters from dying men. The ledgers speak. We often think of medieval warfare in terms of grand battles, but for long-term campaigns in hot climates, the most important documents weren't war chronicles, they were supply logs. Take the provisioning scrolls from a Crusader storehouse outside Acre, circa 1225. Mail shirts to be issued only upon threat alert. Helms stored in cool cellars, unusable after noon. Padding linen ration increased, more requests for cotton innerwear from traders. None of these notes are dramatic, but each reflects an awareness creeping in, that the desert kills slowly, and that protection, if applied the wrong way, becomes liability. The numbers told the story. Helm wearers had 40% more heat injuries than those using cloth head wraps. Soldiers in half-mail armor lasted longer on patrol, even if they were technically less protected. Gambesons designed for cold, damp climates were replaced with layered linen tunics, washed in vinegar and water. Grease, sand, and sweat, maintenance becomes warfare. When sand gets into chainmail, it becomes a living file, grinding down links with every step. Armor wasn't just something to clean, it was something to manage strategically. Each outpost developed its own routine. From a fortress in the Negev desert, 1230. Each knight is to remove his hauberk after patrol, armor to be scrubbed with sand and vinegar mixture, dried, then re-oiled using goat fat and palm ash. Why ash? Because it thickened the oil, helping it adhere to the mail better under heat. Tools included small hammers for knocking dents, bone picks to clear chainmail rings, linen strips soaked in urine to treat rust, a common method acrid but effective, buckets of cooled sand for abrasive cleaning. This wasn't glamorous. It was boring, smelly, repetitive work, and it had to be done every 2 or 3 days or the armor would begin to fail. And when it failed, it wasn't just discomfort, it was death. Time-based combat, fighting around the sun. Desert warfare didn't happen when the enemy was ready. It happened when the sun allowed it. Commanders adapted with a kind of clockwork pragmatism. Scouting parties left before dawn, returned by late morning. Direct combat operations were scheduled for the 2 hours after sunrise or the 2 before dusk. Midday fighting only occurred during sieges or dire emergencies. One chronicler wrote, almost apologetically, "We waited till the sun lowered. Honor delayed, but so did heat stroke." In other words, victory came to those who watched the sky, not the banner. Even more striking were orders from Grand Master Guirin de Montaigu, Hospitallers, 1226. No knight is to wear full mail between none and vespers approximately 3-6 p.m., save under direct threat. Helms to be worn only on signal, cloth wraps permitted in camp. Let the sun kill, no more of us than the enemy. The beast of burden and of shade. Camels were more than transportation, they were mobile shade. Knights learned to ride beside their camels to take advantage of the shadow. Drape surcoats over camel packs to dry and shade gear. Store water inside armor packs hung from the camel's left side cooler during morning marches. Use camel dung, dry, as a low-smoke fire source for boiling water, minimizing visibility to scouts. In a particularly dull but revealing letter to a commander in Tyre, a Hospitaller logistics officer wrote, "It is not the steel that must be durable but the camel. Invest in good saddles. Helmets rust but camels fail slower." Cultural borrowing, practicality over purity. As the decades wore on, the surviving knights, those with years in the field, looked less like European lords and more like desert mercenaries. They adopted light cotton robes over armor to reduce sun exposure, inspired by Muslim fighters and Berber guides. Laced leather sandals instead of heavy riding boots, quicker to remove, better for heat. Headgear that blended Christian crosses with local turbans, worn more for cooling than identification. Was this controversial? For some, yes. For others, it was common sense. One brother wrote, "Better to offend fashion than to faint in mail." In fact, by the 1240s, some outposts began to issue linen surcoats and head wraps with small embroidered crosses, instead of full-color heraldic designs, lighter, cheaper, easier to wash, and less likely to draw sniper attention. This was not assimilation. It was evolution under pressure. Training with less, surviving longer. Knights in training were once drilled in full mail from youth, but in the desert, instructors began reframing strength training to suit the environment. Training included marching in partial armor with weighted water skins, practicing sword forms in tunic and helmet only, conserving heat, learning to fight defensively, to outlast rather than overpower. And importantly, they were taught to listen to their bodies to recognize early signs of heat illness and to remove gear without waiting for permission. This shift in culture from pride to practicality marked one of the quiet revolutions of desert warfare. Closing thought. Armor was once a symbol of nobility, of divine protection, of fearlessness. But under a sun that cracked stone and boiled blood, it became something else. A burden to be managed, a risk to be calculated, a tradition to be rethought. The knights who survived were not the strongest. They were the most adaptive. The ones who accepted that in a land ruled by heat and sand, a cooler, faster, lighter man might be the only one left standing. By the end of the 13th century, the knight's silhouette had changed. Not in carvings or on tapestries, where they still appeared proudly armored, banners high, eyes fixed on glory, but in reality on the ground, in the dust they wore linen instead of steel, and sandals instead of sabatons. This final section of our story traces how the logistical burden of armor in the desert gradually changed not only what knights wore, but how they fought, how they lived, and ultimately how they faded from the landscape of desert warfare. The disarmament wasn't political. It wasn't symbolic. It was sweaty, rusted, and unremarkable, a matter of slow rot, tactical exhaustion, and historical practicality. The sword, the shield, the shift. As armor changed, so too did the tools of violence. Desert warfare demanded speed over strength and defense over dominance. By the 1260s, records from Hospitaller forts in the Levant show shorter blades issued for mounted patrols, easier to draw, quicker to swing. Shields reduced in size, sometimes made from wicker and leather, lightweight, resistant to heat warp. Maces and axes appearing less frequently, too heavy, and often impractical in open field skirmishes. The ideal desert combatant was no longer a walking wall of steel, but a light rider, able to chase or flee in heat that boiled horses' blood. In private letters and scribe marginalia, commanders began to say what couldn't be said openly. A knight weighed down is a knight already lost. No man wins if he cannot breathe. Bless the mail, but bless also the linen. Fortresses built for breath. Not even architecture escaped the logic of heat. Desert fortresses were adapted to suit the new climate-driven warfare. Vaulted ceilings and open courtyards encouraged airflow. Armories were built underground, insulated by stone and sand. Training yards were shifted to shaded hours before sunrise or after dusk. The real innovation, water priority. Some fortresses added dedicated cisterns for cooling armor, not drinking, just cooling. Helm racks near well rooms, knights would soak their padding, then reinsert it before marching. Stone benches where chainmail could be laid out and dried each night like laundry. This was warfare reimagined not for conquest, but for endurance. The end of plate in the East. Contrary to popular imagination, plate armor never became standard in desert crusader outposts. Why? Too heavy, too hot, too expensive to repair far from Western smithies. Unsuitable for the mobile, skirmish-based conflicts of desert zones. Though full plate became fashionable in Europe by the 14th century, desert knights rarely saw it. Those who did report. A walking oven, shiny, yes, but it rattles before it dies. Even in cooler mountain regions, knights with full plate reported reduced patrol capacity, increased water demand, and slower reaction time. Instead, armor in the East plateaued at mail and cloth hybrids, scale armor with leather backing, occasional cuirasses made from boiled leather or bronze plates, helmets always worn with cloth or wool linings, never bare. The supply chain breaks. By the late 1290s, the Crusader states were unraveling not just from military loss, but from logistical collapse. Armor shipments from Europe dwindled. Skilled smiths either died, retired, or returned to cooler climates. Camels grew more valuable than chainmail, and in a telling moment, one inventory from a fort near Tripoli in 1297 notes: 4 complete suits of armor remain, 1 unclaimed, no requests made. No one wanted it anymore. It had become a burden, not a blessing. The legacy of the light knight. Though the Crusader states would fall, and their heavy knights with them, something of their adaptation survived. Centuries later, desert fighters across North Africa and the Levant, be they Mamluks, Berber rebels, or local militias, would favor the same principles. Minimal armor, cloth protection with airflow, weapons suited to speed, not sea. Respect for the sun as a tactical opponent. It wasn't the armor that persisted, it was the mindset. And in small ways, that mindset echoed back to Europe too, where military gear gradually adapted to allow mobility. not just defense. Final reflection. We think of the knight as armor to the teeth, face hidden, invincible. But the real knights who crossed the desert, year after year, learned another truth. That protection can become a prison. That survival sometimes means removing the armor. That strength is not measured in pounds of steel, but in how far you can walk without fainting. They weren't less noble for lightening their load. They were more human for it. And sometimes that made all the difference. Story 7. Desert Kitchens, How Knights Cooked Without Firewood. The problem was simple. The desert had no trees. Not none, exactly occasional thorny shrubs, the rare oasis palm, but not nearly enough to supply a permanent military outpost with the wood required to cook even a single meal per day for 10 men. And many crusader outposts had dozens. Some had hundreds, yet they cooked every day. The story of how knights prepared food in the heat of the Sahara, Sinai, and Levant without reliable firewood is not a story of brilliance. It is a story of dull persistence, slow adaptation, and the boring ingenuity of logistics. Because while battles made songs and saints made stories, cooking lentils without smoke was a victory all its own. A fuel shortage that wasn't news. Knights arriving from Europe quickly realized that their expectations of a campfire-based kitchen were misguided. In the forests of France or the hills of Saxony, one could fell a tree, chop kindling, build a roaring fire, cook stews in iron pots. In the desert, no such luck. Wood was rare, expensive, often green, and thus smoky, slow-burning, and inefficient. Reserved for emergency signaling, not daily use. So they turned to what the desert offered. Not in abundance, but in predictable scarcity. Cooking with dung, the unspoken norm. By the mid-1100s, most Crusader desert outposts had shifted from firewood to animal dung as their primary fuel source. Camel dung, especially when sun-dried, was valued for its low smoke and slow, steady burn. Goat and sheep droppings, collected and packed into clay or straw-lined bins, made good kindling when dried. Human waste, rarely used, more common among emergency survival groups, not routine kitchens. Dung was shaped into fuel bricks, often mixed with chaff or crushed reeds, then dried on flat stones in the sun. These bricks could be stacked, transported, and stored like firewood. They didn't smell once fully dried, at least not to men already soaked in sweat, vinegar, and dust. And they worked. One knight stationed near Gaza wrote, "We cook by camel, not from its meat but its leavings." It wasn't a joke, it was just how they lived. The heat trap, desert solar cooking. In especially dry seasons, even dung could be hard to come by. So some outposts turned to an even slower but effective method, solar heat traps. These weren't high-tech devices, just flat stones arranged in a parabolic curve. A blackened pot or clay dish at the center. A cloth or skin covering to reduce wind and dust. And patience, lots of patience. Common uses: heating water for tea or purification. Softening dried legumes or lentils. Gently warming preserved meat. Cooking this way took hours, but for stations where heat was more reliable than fuel, it became a daily routine. One recorded technique involved placing clay jars filled with chickpeas and salted water in shallow pits covered with oiled linen. By late afternoon, the water would be near boiling. It was slow food, because there was no fast way to cook without a tree. Salt drying and soaking, fireless food prep. Another strategy: avoid fire altogether by changing what you eat. Desert kitchens often relied on ingredients that required minimal or no cooking. Salted fish chewed like jerky or soaked overnight in vinegar. Hard bread baked elsewhere, broken and softened with broth or water. Preserved dates and figs energy-rich and fire-free. soaked lentils and beans, fermented slightly to improve digestibility. Pickled vegetables, made with brine and buried in sealed jars for weeks. Knights were not gourmets, they were survivalists. The goal was not pleasure, but calories that wouldn't spoil. And they succeeded through boredom, drying, soaking, salting, and waiting. Controlled flame zones, how fires were managed. In outposts with enough resources to burn regularly, fires were confined to specific pits, often surrounded by stone. Used only during low-wind hours, early morning, dusk. Shielded by dung walls or palm-woven barriers to prevent smoke detection by enemies. Kept very small, just enough to boil water, not enough to roast meat. Guards were sometimes assigned to the kitchen fires not to stir pots, but to ensure flames stayed hidden. In desert warfare, a plume of smoke meant vulnerability. So a well-run kitchen was not only a place of sustenance, it was a place of security discipline. Clay pots, slow knives, and the smell of boiling lentils. Despite these limitations, knights did cook, and they ate hot food. One typical kitchen setup in a Crusader desert post included a single fire pit, reinforced with stone and clay. 3 large clay pots for boiling grain, softening legumes, and making broth. 2 iron skewers, used sparingly for meat when available. A hand-cranked stone mill for turning barley into flour or mash. Reed mats and linen cloths for food preparation. Meals were repetitive. Morning, flat barley bread in vinegar water. Midday, lentils or dried peas with oil. Evening, same, with dates or pickled turnips if available. The smell of cooking wasn't savory. It was functional, fermented, earthy, sometimes smoky, always faint. But it kept them alive. Closing thought. We remember knights for their armor, their swords, their battles. But their true strength may have been found in the kitchen, not in what they cooked, but in how they managed to cook without the very thing civilization is built on: firewood. They boiled chickpeas with dung. They made bread without ovens. They learned to soak, to salt, to wait. Not because they were monks or mystics, but because the desert doesn't care about chivalry. It cares only whether you've eaten. In the Crusader desert outposts, there was no kitchen staff. There were no professional cooks, no castle kitchens with hearths the size of wagons, no endless barrels of spices, nor orchards heavy with fruit. There was only what could be carried, preserved, or scavenged, and above all, there were lentils. If there was a single defining staple of desert night cuisine, it was the lentil. Boiled in clay pots, soaked in vinegar, stored dry in sacks, it appeared in almost every meal. This section explores how food became less about nourishment and more about management. Meals were planned like campaigns. Every sack of beans was a ledger entry, every drop of oil a luxury. The kitchen became a quiet war room where survival through systems took the place of recipes. Counting lentils, monastic precision in the desert. At a Templar station near the Dead Sea, a surviving provisioning list from 1271 shows 340 pounds of dried lentils, 170 pounds of barley, 92 preserved lemons, 40 flasks of vinegar, 12 flasks of olive oil, 6 sacks of salt. No meat listed. One note at the bottom: reserve 5 measures in case of siege. This wasn't food, this was logistics. Every night was allocated a handful of lentils per day, roughly 100-150 g. 2 strips of hard bread. Water with vinegar for rehydration and disinfection. If supplies were short, lentils were ground into flour, fried in oil if available to make thin cakes, mixed with pickled onion and crushed herbs, forming something like a rudimentary paste. The food wasn't varied, but it was calculated. Every meal had to keep a man alive without causing illness, without spoiling, and without drawing enemy attention with smoke. Salted fish and the trade of taste. Lentils alone weren't enough. Knights depended heavily on preserved foods, especially salted or dried fish. These came from Mediterranean ports like Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa, occasionally from local oases, where small ponds yielded mudfish or catfish, often from trade with Muslim caravans, despite the ongoing conflicts. Fish was usually soaked overnight to reduce salt content, shredded or mashed and mixed with vinegar or oil, added sparingly to lentils or grain stews. One knight in a letter, circa 1260, remarked, "The fish is not for flavor, it is for memory. It reminds me there is a sea, though I have not seen it in years." Salted meat also existed, but was rarer, typically reserved for vista, visiting commanders, men returning from extended patrols. Even then, it was often more symbolic than satisfying. The role of the pickled vegetable. Another forgotten hero of the desert kitchen, pickled things. When fresh vegetables were available, onions, turnips, even carrots, they were quickly sliced or grated, packed in salt, drowned in vinegar and brine, stored in clay jars sealed with wax or linen, buried partially in sand to stay cool. Pickled vegetables served multiple purposes: a source of vitamin C, preventing scurvy; a counterbalance to the monotony of lentils and bread; a method of reusing brine, which was often passed from jar to jar for months. The brine itself, sometimes flavored with dried mint or crushed garlic, became a cooking ingredient. It added sharpness to otherwise bland food and helped stretch vinegar rations. Some jars were more than a year old. The vegetables inside were soft, limp, unrecognizable but not spoiled. Oil, the real luxury. Olive oil was rare, highly valued, sometimes stolen, sometimes gifted, sometimes fought over. Used for cooking when possible, preserving garlic or herbs, as a base for emergency ointments, lighting simple clay lamps. Each flask was counted, inventoried, and often rationed drop by drop. Some kitchens developed oil alternatives. Animal fat, usually goat or sheep, pungent but serviceable. Rendered marrow from dried bones. Fermented date paste, slightly oily when warmed, used for baking. Still, when oil arrived, everything changed. Meals went from merely edible to tolerable, even momentarily pleasant. A pot of lentils, a splash of oil, and a dash of vinegar could feel like a feast. Reusing everything. Efficiency wasn't a virtue, it was a necessity. Pickled brine was reused for boiling grain. Lentil water, after boiling, was poured over dry bread to soften it. Bread crumbs were collected, dried, and added to barley cakes. Even lentil skins, after boiling and straining, were sometimes mashed into pastes for spreading. Kitchen waste was almost non-existent. Everything not eaten was burned rarely, fed to goats if any were kept, dried and added back into animal dung fuel bricks. In effect, the Crusader kitchen became a closed system, a cycle of scarcity refined over years into something approaching stability. Fermented beverages, the surprise elixir. Alcohol was rare in desert outposts due to spoilage, weight, and expense. But rudimentary fermented drinks existed, often made from barley mash left to sour, date wine thick, syrupy, and sometimes prohibited. A vinegar-based drink called pasca, made by diluting strong vinegar with water and herbs. Knights drank these not to become drunk, but to stay hydrated, aid digestion, mask the taste of stagnant water, give their bodies something other than dust. One record reads, 2 cups of mash, 1 cup of water, 1 prayer for clean belly. Closing thought. It's easy to forget how much history hinges not on grand speeches or battles, but on whether a man could cook a pot of lentils without dying of thirst. Desert kitchens weren't about flavor. They were about systems, preservation, and repetition. The salt fish kept them alive. The lentils gave them strength. The vinegar reminded them they were still human. The nights may have come for glory, but they stayed alive through pickled turnips and boiled grain, one quiet meal at a time. A knight's survival in the desert rarely hinged on his sword. More often, it depended on a cracked clay pot, a handful of barley, and someone who knew how to cook without wood, meat, or freshness. Behind the walls of forgotten crusader outposts tucked between dunes, buried in wind-silted stone small kitchens worked daily miracles with nothing. This final section focuses on the everyday operations of these desert kitchens, the men who ran them, the systems they built, and how food became a form of discipline, memory, and endurance. Because the desert didn't just cook food, it cooked expectations. And in that slow boil, nights became something different, resourceful, patient, and stubbornly alive. Who cooked the food? There were no chefs, no kitchen titles like master of the pantry or feast steward as in European castles. In most desert garrisons, rotational duty was standard. Every man, regardless of rank, cooked eventually. A few older or injured knights often stayed in the kitchens full-time, not out of choice, but necessity. Occasionally, local laborers or servants helped, often paid with food or salt. Some pilgrims or traveling monks passing through offered skills in exchange for rations. These weren't gourmet cooks. They were problem solvers. They knew how to keep a fire low and long burning with minimal fuel, measure out exact portions to stretch weeks, spot mold, spoilage, or brine failure before it spread, bake flatbread in heated clay against stone walls without an oven. And they didn't cook for compliments. They cooked so the next patrol would come back alive. The communal pot. Many outposts used a single communal pot for daily meals. This had advantages. Fuel efficiency, one fire, one vessel. Simplicity, everyone ate the same. Hygiene control, easier to monitor for spoilage. Into the pot went soaked lentils or barley, brine or vinegar water, any preserved scraps, onions, pickled turnips, bits of salted fish, herbs if available, thyme, mint, garlic shoots, occasional oil if rationing allowed, crumbled bread crusts to thicken the stew. The stew cooked slowly, sometimes over 6 hours with the lid on, fire low, and stones placed on top to hold in heat. By evening the food was ready. It was never hot, just warm, soft, and sustaining. Eating in silence. Meals were not events, they were quiet, practical moments. Food was eaten with fingers, or occasionally with shared spoons. Bowls were made of clay, wood, or metal, depending on rank and supplies. Men often ate together in the shade, seated on stones or mats. Prayers were said not for indulgence, but for thanks that the food was not spoiled. One Templar rulebook noted, "Silence during the meal is encouraged. Let the body eat and the soul consider its fortune." Even in mealtime, the emphasis was on discipline, not comfort. The weekly rhythm. While the daily meal changed little, outposts often had weekly kitchen routines. Day 1-3. Barley-based stew with lentils. Brine vegetables added. Day 4. Bread baking day, sun-dried or stone-fired. Extra rations for men returning from patrol. Day 5. Salted fish rehydrated and added. Strong vinegar drink issued, internal cleansing. Day 6. Thin porridge with date syrup, if available. Oil rations reviewed and adjusted. Day 7. Communion bread prepared by clergy, if present. The best meal of the week, if rations allowed. This rhythm wasn't festive. It was ritualistic, a way to structure time, maintain order, and prevent cooking fatigue from leading to carelessness or waste. Cleanliness, spoilage, and the battle against rot. In the heat, a spoiled pot could mean a week of illness, or worse. Kitchens developed strict hygiene methods. Pots were scraped daily with sand and boiled water. Storage jars were lined with linen soaked in vinegar. Clay jars were buried to stay cool, a primitive refrigeration. Any signs of insects, mold, or swelling meant immediate disposal, even at a cost. Some outposts used burn pits outside the walls to dispose of spoiled food, a rare waste, but necessary. Water, the most critical resource, was rationed for drinking, but some was set aside for food prep and washing, under strict inventory. Kitchens as tools of morale. Food in the desert wasn't just survival, it was the last shared ritual. When nothing else worked, no victories, no reinforcements, no good news, a hot meal, however bland, provided. A sense of order. A break in monotony. A reason to sit together. A tie to home through familiar textures and tastes. One night wrote in a personal journal, "We do not feast, we do not fast, we eat to keep our eyes open, that is enough." And it was. The act of cooking, consuming, cleaning, and beginning again was an act of resilience in itself. Final reflection. They crossed deserts in armor, battled heat, disease, and hopeless odds, but they always stopped to cook. In the shade of crumbling walls, in tents with sand floors, beside dry wells, they stirred pots and soaked bread. They did not cook to live well. They cooked to live at all. And in that quiet act, repeated day after day, they made their stand not with sword, but with spoon. The desert could take their strength, their steel, their breath, but it could not take their discipline. And that discipline lived in the cookpot. Story 8, Sandstorms and Sabotage, How Weather Became a Weapon. There were days when the sky itself betrayed them. No battle horn, no enemy charge, just a sudden gust, a shifting of the wind, and then the world turned to grit. Vision gone, lungs burning, metal searing under sand-blasted heat. Horses spooked. Camels collapsed. Formations broke not from arrows, but from air. In this story, we turn to the most overlooked opponent in desert warfare, the weather, particularly the sandstorm, that grim, grinding wall of dust that arrived without notice and left behind confusion, silence, and bodies. This isn't the story of a single battle. It's the ongoing, invisible campaign fought between men and the environment, and how the cleverest commanders learned not to fight the weather, but to weaponize it. The nature of the storm. To understand how sandstorms influenced history, you must first understand what they were. In Arabic, they are often called letter 1e25, a b umacron b sudden, violent dust, storms that form from downdrafts in thunderstorms, pushing massive clouds of dry sand across the desert at speeds up to 100 km/h, 60 mph. They were blinding, deafening, dry enough to crack skin and strip paint from wood, capable of disrupting entire caravans, let alone military formations. To crusaders and European knights, they were an alien force, a weather phenomenon they had no preparation for. To local fighters and nomadic tribes, they were opportunities, lost in the dust. In one incident, recorded near El Arish in 1183, a company of knights en route to a rendezvous point were overtaken by a sudden sandstorm. What happened? The lead scout's horse bolted at the first blast. Their supply camel turned back, fleeing instinctively into the wind. Men in mail armor became disoriented as their eye slits filled with sand. Helmets amplified the howling wind, creating a kind of claustrophobic panic. When the storm cleared, the unit was scattered across 5 miles of desert. They weren't attacked, they weren't defeated. But 3 died from exposure, and the mission was abandoned. Sabotage by sand. Over time, Local desert forces, notably Berber auxiliaries, Mamluks, and various Bedouin clans, began to anticipate sandstorms the way a sailor watches clouds at sea. They learned to launch small raids just before a sandstorm hit, then vanish into the grit. Drive enemy patrols into open terrain during dust season. Set traps, shallow pits, spiked caltrops, or oil-soaked cloths on known storm routes where visibility would be zero. One particularly dull but telling document from a Frankish outpost reads, "We lost the mules near Wadi al-Hamra, saw no attack, only wind, but the saddles were cut, not torn." The conclusion: ambushed by weather, covered by sand. No arrows, no blood, just clever placement and timing. Fortifications and sand wind design. Even Crusader architecture was slowly altered in response to these conditions. Some adjustments included wind-deflecting ramparts angled to reduce internal accumulation of sand, partial underground kitchens and storage rooms to prevent food spoilage during storms, sluice-like doorways forcing wind to pass through angled turns, courtyards with raised stone paths so that even when buried in sand, foot traffic could continue. And perhaps most interesting, canvas tension roofs reinforced with rope installed in desert command tents angled to allow sand to pass over rather than tear through. These were not dramatic innovations, but they reflected an ongoing reality. We do not build against man, we build against the storm. Equipment adaptations. Knights quickly learned what worked and what didn't during sandstorms. Failures. Metal helms with narrow slits trapped dust. Chainmail links clogged, making movement rigid and noisy. Leather straps cracked if not constantly oiled. Open-mouth breathing led to choking, bleeding gums, or worse. Adaptations. Cloth face wraps soaked in vinegar. Goggles of oiled parchment stretched over wood frames. Swords kept in oilcloth instead of scabbards. Water skins stored inside larger fabric sacks to keep the leather from drying out. What was once seen as unknightly covering one's face, removing helm, wrapping in rags, became standard operating practice. Survival trumped aesthetics. Training for the unexpected. Some commanders began to train specifically for storm conditions. These exercises involved marching blindfolded, learning to rely on foot patterns and memory. Formations drilled by whistle, not voice. Emergency shelter practice, using cloaks and shield formations to survive blasts. Sandstorm simulations using fine ash or dust, blown manually into training areas. And most importantly, learning to stop. The instinct to run in low visibility was fatal. Men were trained to go to ground, stay still, and wait. This level of patience, foreign to most knights, was slowly drilled into them through boring repetition. Closing thought. A knight in gleaming armor could defeat a man, but he could not defeat the wind. The desert had no loyalty, no mercy, no sides. It punished arrogance and rewarded patience. And the commanders who learned to see storms not as obstacles but as tools. They were the ones whose outposts remained standing. Not because they fought harder, but because they knew when not to move at all. Victory in the desert didn't always go to the boldest knight or the largest force. Sometimes it went to the ones who understood the wind's rhythm, those who knew when the sand would move, not just how, those who could wait 2 hours or even 2 weeks for the weather to turn in their favor, and then strike. In this section, we explore how timing became a tactical skill, how commanders learned to predict sandstorms using subtle cues, how seasons shaped campaign routes, and how weather itself beyond terrain or manpower began to dictate the calendar of war. Because in the desert, even battles had to wait on the wind. The calendar of dust. Desert warfare wasn't fought year-round. Local forces, Especially nomadic tribes and desert-hardened militias knew that certain months brought certain winds, and they organized their movements around them. Two key seasons mattered most. One Khamsin spring occurred roughly between March and May. Hot, dry, and marked by violent sandstorms that could last days. Often followed seasonal rains, drying the ground rapidly. Known for fine, choking dust that could block vision and burn lungs. During Khamsin, large-scale battles were rare. Instead, ambushes, raids, and supply line sabotage increased. Commanders used the unpredictability to distract or split enemy units. Forts doubled rations, knowing travel would be difficult. A single planned movement during Khamsin could fail due to a day's miscalculation. To Sirocco season, late summer/early fall. Hot winds blowing from the Sahara northwards. Less dusty than Khamsin, but brought oppressive heat and unstable air. Often triggered heat-related illness and camel unrest. Campaigns slowed during these months. Knights traveled at night. Patrols were short and frequent. Cooking became difficult due to flame instability and high wind. The men didn't fear the enemy. They feared the breeze. Reading the desert, weather as intelligence. Knights may have lacked meteorology, but they learned slowly to read the land. Some clues included animal behavior. Horses pawing or refusing to drink often signaled coming wind. Shifts in air. Smell dry, bitter scents often preceded a storm. Sky texture. Thin yellow haze across the horizon meant approaching dust. Static in cloth or hair. Buildup of charge could signal dry, turbulent wind ahead. Watchmen on towers weren't just scanning for enemies. They were trained to spot sudden ripples in distant sand, changes in cloud density, patterns in how smoke from cooking fires bent or flattened. These signs were used to cancel marches, call scouts back early, delay battles even if it meant lost ground. The cost of misjudging weather was not discomfort. It was death by exposure, confusion, and separation. Ambush and cover, tactical use of storms. Some commanders became masters of concealment via storm. In several recorded incidents, raiding parties timed their approach to coincide with forecasted winds, using the sand to obscure numbers. Knights were lured into valleys or flats where sand would gather and swirl. Decoy fires were lit before a storm to bait scouts, then extinguished when the wind came. Pre-dug trenches were used by local fighters to hide during storms, emerging once the chaos cleared. One Crusader report from a Templar patrol near Petra in 1252 notes, "They vanished into the air. We saw no banner, no blade, only grit. When it cleared, 6 were missing, and we found their packs opened." It wasn't sorcery. It was well-timed wind and better knowledge of terrain. Defensive protocols for wind warfare. Crusader outposts eventually created storm-specific defensive routines. When sandstorms were forecast, guards rotated hourly to avoid sand blindness. Outer gates were sealed, leaving only small side entries open. Horses and camels were tethered inside low-walled corrals, protected from sudden gusts. All food and water stores were double-covered. Mail armor was removed and hung, as sand could stiffen it beyond wearability. Weapons were cleaned before and after storms. A small detail, but an important one. Sand inside crossbow mechanisms could jam firing pins or warp tension strings. Supply lines and weather delays. Sandstorms also turned logistics into guesswork. Supply routes between strongholds, some stretching 40 or 50 miles, were vulnerable to lost messengers, buried tracks making map navigation difficult, spoiled food from blown sand, contaminating storage sacks, pack animals fleeing mid-storm, taking weeks to recover. To cope, commanders developed staggered relay points, small shaded stations every 8-10 miles. backup caches buried in marked sand pits, use of reed-wrapped containers to reduce dust infiltration, cloth-wrapped bread tied with oiled rope, an anti-dust strategy borrowed from Bedouins. Still, no system was perfect. One delayed shipment could mean rationing by the 4th day and starvation by the 7th. The desert didn't just stall armies. It eroded them. Closing thought. It wasn't always the blade, nor the banner, nor even the commander's skill that decided fate in the desert. Sometimes it was a poorly timed march or a refusal to delay. The desert moved in rhythms. Those who fought against them were buried. Those who waited quietly, patiently, boringly outlasted the storm. And in that waiting, they learned that history isn't shaped by grand gestures. Sometimes it's shaped by pausing for wind. At some point, the storm stopped being a threat and became a weapon. Not a weapon of steel or fire or force, but a weapon of planning, of misdirection, and of knowing when not to act. In this final section, we explore how the most adaptive commanders on both sides of the Crusades began to build weather into their strategy. The storm was no longer something to fear. It was something to wait for, to manipulate, and even to create confusion so complete that entire fortresses fell without a proper siege. It wasn't a revolution in military theory. It was just patient, dusty sabotage. Case study: the ghost attack at Hamad Ridge, 1248. This little-known incident, reported in a Templar letter fragment found near Jericho, tells of a mysterious event. A Crusader supply outpost was found abandoned overnight, food half-eaten, watch stations empty. No signs of battle, no dead, no breached gates. The only clue: the sand was deep in the well, the fire was still warm, and the tracks vanished halfway to the east. The truth, pieced together later by surviving scouts, revealed this. A local tribal group had watched the weather and knew a sandstorm was coming from the south. Just before it hit, they launched a nighttime assault, not a full fight, but a noise campaign. Animal horns, crashing shields, and whistles. In the confusion and darkness, the knights, blinded, panicked, abandoned the post and fled into the storm. 3 were lost, the rest regrouped days later. No blood was spilled, no sword was drawn. The storm did the work. Sabotage from within, caravans, camels, and disinformation. Sometimes the weather wasn't just used as cover, it became the bait. Certain tactics emerged that were so subtle, they almost seemed too boring to mention, yet they were devastatingly effective. Examples include releasing camels or donkeys with bells tied to their saddles into enemy territory during a windstorm, creating the illusion of a marching column. Spreading false messages via intercepted runners. Commander requests reinforcements before the sandstorm. Those reinforcements would then be swallowed by the weather. Lighting fires far from actual positions before a storm, smoke trails were exaggerated by wind, misleading scouts. In each case, the sandstorm acted not just as confusion, but as confirmation of a false narrative. The enemy couldn't double-check. They couldn't see, couldn't hear, and most importantly, couldn't wait. Wind-assisted attacks. While most armies feared the reduced visibility of storms, some used it to attack with perfect timing. Arrows shot with the wind could travel 20–30% farther. Shouts and commands were drowned out, making coordination near impossible. Footprints disappeared quickly, allowing smaller units to escape or reposition unseen. One commander, named Yusuf ibn Khalid, was known for attacking just as storms began, retreating within 30 minutes. His signature was no return path. He taught his men to memorize terrain by touch, count steps between landmarks, track enemies by smell and fabric movement, not sight. His forces became known as the Dustwalkers, silent, deadly, and gone before the storm faded. The psychology of dust. Even when not used directly, Sandstorms worked as psychological tools. Commanders began to schedule mock deployments before predicted storms, knowing the enemy would be forced into constant alert, which fatigued guards, early movements, which exposed them to ambush, delayed travel, which wore out animals and morale. Over time, Crusader outposts reported higher rates of sleep disruption during dust season, increased paranoia among sentries, frequent false alarms, especially in units unfamiliar with storm signs. It wasn't superstition. It was just weather-induced tension, leveraged deliberately. Sand as siege weapon. In some of the more desperate or drawn-out campaigns, even the sand itself was used in physical sabotage. Examples include diverting sand into enemy wells using trenches and angled cloths, filling ventilation shafts with sand during sieges, forcing heat and smoke buildup, burying snares and spikes just below the sand's surface undetectable once the wind passed, blocking caravan routes by shifting sand over known trails, rendering maps temporarily useless. One chronicler notes, "It took 6 men 4 days to dig the grain wagons free. When they were uncovered, the grain had spoiled from the pressure and heat. A week of food lost not by sword, but by sediment." When weather was the deciding force. Looking back, historians now understand that several sieges ended not from starvation or defeat, but because a seasonal wind change made continued fighting untenable. At least 2 Crusader retreats were triggered not by enemy force, but by anticipated whether officers feared losing men to sand more than to battle. Some truces and parley agreements were negotiated during dust season, because neither side could maintain open roads or fresh water. In these cases, the weather wasn't the background. It was the arbiter, and both sides, reluctantly or cleverly, obeyed it. Final reflection. We often imagine warfare as a contest of force, stronger walls, sharper swords, better trained men. But in the desert, the sharpest edge was often the invisible one. A wind carefully timed, a storm cleverly anticipated, a path erased by dust. These were the weapons of those who watched the sky more than the horizon. And those who did. They didn't always win, but they always lasted longer. The desert made no promises, but for those who listened to its silence, it sometimes whispered victory.